Almost everyone alive can draw it. A ring of enormous grey stones standing on open grassland, some of them capped with lintels laid across their tops, the whole thing weathered and lichened and utterly unmistakable. It appears on stamps and album covers and tea towels. It is one of perhaps a dozen structures on Earth that a person can recognize from a silhouette alone in the same company as the pyramids and the Colosseum and the Moai of Easter Island. Roughly 1 million people a year travel to a chalk plateau in southern England to stand in front of it. And almost everything that most people believe about it is wrong. It was not built by Druids. That is the single most widespread belief about Stonehenge, and it is not a matter of scholarly dispute. The monument was already ancient. Already, in fact, largely abandoned. For something like 2,000 years before the Druids existed. It was not built by Romans, who arrived nearly 3,000 years too late and seem to have regarded it as a curiosity. It was not built by Merlin, or by refugees from Atlantis, or by anyone from anywhere other than Britain. And it was not built to watch the midsummer sunrise, which is the thing the crowds gather for every June, and which faces, quite precisely, the wrong way. Hello, traveller. Tonight, we set out on the entire story of Stonehenge, who really raised those stones, how they moved them, what the monument was actually for, and why, after 1,500 years of work, the people who built it simply stopped. Before we begin, take a moment, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel, but only if these journeys are truly yours. And leave a word below to say where you're listening from tonight and the hour it is where you are. There's a quiet pleasure in seeing who else has gathered here tonight, in how many countries, under how many skies. Now, let the lights go low, let the world go quiet, and let's step into the story together. Here is what is actually true, and it is considerably stranger than the folklore. Stonehenge was built by Neolithic farmers, the first people in Britain to grow crops and keep herds, working over a period of roughly 1,500 years in stages beginning around 3000 BC. That start date is worth holding on to. The first phase of Stonehenge is older than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and the monument's construction spans a length of time that is difficult to hold in the mind. 1,500 years is roughly the distance between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the present day. A person who watched the first ditch being cut and a person who saw the last bluestone repositioned were separated by more generations than divide us from the Norman conquest twice over. Nobody who began Stonehenge saw it finished. Nobody who finished it had met anyone who remembered why it was started. When the earliest ditch was being cut on Salisbury Plain, with picks made from red deer antler, there was no pharaoh in Egypt, no writing in Mesopotamia worth the name, and nothing at all in Britain that we would recognise as a town. Those builders dragged some of the stones a very long way. The Great Grey Sarsens, the largest weighing around 25 tons, came from about 25 kilometres to the north, which is impressive enough when you consider there were no wheels in use in Britain, no draft animals trained for hauling on that scale, and no metal tools of any kind. But the smaller stones, the ones called bluestones, came from the Preseli Hills in West Wales, 250 kilometres away, across rivers and mountains and more. Nobody has ever produced a fully satisfying explanation of why. There was perfectly good stone within sight of the site. They went to Wales anyway, repeatedly, and brought back 80 or so stones weighing 2 to 4 tons each. And the monument's purpose is not the temple to the sun that everyone assumes. Stonehenge is, among other things, a cemetery. One of the largest Neolithic burial grounds in Britain, holding the cremated remains of at least 150 people, and probably many more. It sits at the centre of an enormous ritual landscape crowded with burial mounds, processional avenues, timber circles, and a short walk away, what appears to have been the largest settlement in Neolithic Britain, occupied by the people who built it, and littered with the bones of feasts on a scale that has no parallel in prehistoric Europe. The stones are the famous part. They are not the whole thing, and they may not even be the most interesting part. Tonight we will go through all of it in order. We will start before the stones, with the strange evidence that this exact spot was already special to hunter-gatherers 4,000 years before the first ditch was cut. We will follow the building through its long stages and go to the Welsh quarries that were found only in the last decade, and look at how you actually raise a 25-ton block and lay a lintel on top of it with no crane. We will walk out into the landscape around the stones, to Durrington Walls and the feasting grounds and the avenue that runs down to the river, and see what the whole complex was doing. We will look at who the builders were, and at the genetic evidence, published within the last few years, that the people who finished Stonehenge were not descended from the people who started it. And then we will ask, honestly, what it was for, and why they abandoned it, and how a Neolithic cemetery on a chalk plain became the most recognisable ruin on earth and got attached to a priesthood that never set foot in it. Before the story, the object. Most people carry a vague picture of a ring of stones, and the real structure is more specific and more deliberate than that. And knowing its anatomy makes everything that follows legible. Start from the outside and work in. The outermost element is a circular earthwork, a bank and a ditch enclosing an area about 100 metres across. This is the oldest part of the monument, and it is easy to overlook because it is now low and grassed over, but it was once a bright white ring cut into the chalk, visible from a long way off across the downland. Just inside the bank runs a ring of 56 pits, discovered in the 17th century and named the Aubrey holes after the man who found them. They once held something upright, timber posts, or possibly an early arrangement of bluestones, and many of them were later used to bury cremated human remains. Inside that, the stones. There are two kinds, and the difference matters enormously. The Sarsens are the giants, hard grey sandstone, the largest standing stones weighing around 25 tons and rising over 4 metres above ground with a substantial length buried beneath. They form two arrangements. The outer is a circle of 30 upright Sarsens, originally capped by a continuous ring of 30 lintels laid end to end all the way around. A stone circle that was also, remarkably, a stone hoop, a closed ring suspended in the air. Inside that circle stand 5 trilithons, pairs of uprights with a single lintel across each, arranged in a horseshoe that opens toward the northeast and rising in height toward the centre, so that the great central trilithon was the tallest thing on the plain. The bluestones are the smaller ones, 2 to 4 tons each, dolerite and rhyolite and other volcanic rocks, bluish when wet or freshly broken. The name is a modern convenience covering a surprisingly varied group. Geologists have distinguished well over a dozen distinct rock types among them from several different outcrops. They are not one quarry's worth of stone. They are a collection, assembled from a spread of sources across the Preseli region, which complicates any simple story about a single expedition, and suggests either repeated journeys or a gathering together of stones that already had separate histories. They are arranged in their own circle and horseshoe, echoing the Sarsen layout at a smaller scale, and they have been moved and rearranged more than once in the monument's history. That restlessness is itself a puzzle. The bluestones were set up, taken down, moved, and re-erected in different configurations across several centuries. In a ring, in a horseshoe, in an oval, in arrangements that have left overlapping socket patterns archaeologists are still untangling. Whatever the Sarsens were, they were built once and stayed. The blue stones were handled repeatedly, as though the arrangement mattered and kept needing correction, or as though moving them was itself part of what the monument was for. And they are the ones that came from Wales. Outside the circle, to the northeast, stands the Heelstone, a large, unshaped sarsen leaning by the side of the processional avenue, and running away from that entrance, the avenue itself, a pair of parallel banks and ditches that curves away for about 3 kilometres, eventually reaching the River Avon. 2 more details deserve attention because they are what separate Stonehenge from every other stone circle in Britain, and there are around 1,000 of those. First, the stones are shaped. Almost everywhere else, standing stones are erected as found. At Stonehenge, the Sarsens were dressed, pounded into shape with stone hammers, their faces flattened, their sides subtly tapered so that the uprights narrow toward the top, an effect that makes them look taller from below. Second, the lintels are jointed. They are held on the uprights by mortise and tenon joints. A projecting knob on the top of each upright fitting into a hollow cut in the underside of the lintel, and joined to each other end to end by tongue and groove. Those are carpentry joints. Somebody took the techniques for working timber and executed them in 25-ton blocks of sandstone using stone tools. And that tells you where the design came from. Britain in this period had a long tradition of timber circles, rings of substantial posts, built and rebuilt across centuries at sites all over the country, including Durrington itself. The people who raised Stonehenge had grown up in a world of monumental carpentry. When they came to build in stone, they did not invent a new architectural language. They translated the one they had. Stonehenge is, in a real sense, a timber circle rendered in rock, which is why it is unique. Nobody else took the translation that literally. Nothing else in prehistoric Europe looks like this. Stonehenge is not a big stone circle. It is a stone circle built by people who were thinking like architects. Now, the honest accounting, because Stonehenge is a subject where confident claims outnumber evidence by a wide margin, and the honest version is the more interesting one. Here is what is known with real confidence. The monument was built and modified in stages across roughly 1,500 years, from about 3000 BC to about 1500 BC. The earthwork came first. The Great Sarsen structure was raised around 2500 BC in what appears to have been a relatively short and intense burst of work. The bluestones arrived early and were rearranged repeatedly. The site was used for cremation burials over a long period, particularly in its earlier phases. Its principal axis is aligned on the solstices, and the surrounding landscape contains an extraordinary density of related monuments built by the same communities. Here is what is not known, and probably cannot be. What any of it meant to the people who built it. What they called it, which gods or ancestors they addressed there. What happened during a ceremony. What a person felt walking up the avenue at midwinter. There is no writing. There will never be writing. Everything about the intentions behind Stonehenge is inference from physical remains, and the honest researcher's position is that we can reconstruct what was done with increasing precision and can only reason cautiously about why. There is a further trap worth naming at the start. Stonehenge attracts theories the way few other sites do, and the reason is structural. It is enormously famous, visually striking, undeniably ancient and silent. That combination is an invitation. Over the centuries, it has been attributed to Druids, Romans, Danes, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Atlanteans, and visitors from other worlds, and it has been explained as a temple, an observatory, a computer, a healing shrine, a burial ground, a coronation site, and a landing beacon. Some of those ideas are serious and some are not, but nearly all of them share one assumption, which is worth flagging now because it will come up again, that the people living in Britain at the time could not have done it themselves. They could. They did. And the archaeology of the last 30 years, much of it very recent, has made the how far clearer than it was, while leaving the why exactly as open as it always was. That is the shape of tonight. A great deal of hard-won, genuinely astonishing detail about the building of this thing, wrapped around a silence at the centre that no amount of excavation is going to fill. The setting matters, because Stonehenge is not a monument that happens to be somewhere. It is a monument that is deeply, specifically about where it is. Salisbury Plain is a chalk plateau in southern England, and chalk shapes everything about the place. It is a soft white rock formed from the compressed shells of marine organisms over tens of millions of years, and it drains freely, which means the downland above it is dry, open, and easy to walk across. But also that it holds little surface water, so rivers run in the valleys and settlement clusters near them. The soil is thin. The grass is short and springy. Chalk downland turf is one of the richest plant habitats in Europe by species count. Dozens of flowering plants can occur in a single square metre, kept low and diverse by grazing. And that grazing is the reason the plain looks as it does. It has been kept open by sheep and cattle almost continuously since the Neolithic. Left alone, it would revert to scrub and then woodland within a few decades. The famous emptiness around Stonehenge is not natural. It is 5,000 years of animals eating. Cut into the turf and you hit brilliant white chalk within a few centimetres, which is why a ditch dug here in 3000 BC would have blazed white across the landscape, and why the great hill figures of southern England are visible for miles. The plain is not flat. It rolls in long, low swells, and the Stonehenge site sits on a slight rise within a shallow basin, which produces a particular effect that visitors consistently notice, and that must have been intentional. As you approach along the avenue from the northeast, the monument is hidden until you come over the crest, and then it appears whole all at once. Whoever chose that spot understood the theatre of the approach, and the approach is long. Walking the full avenue from the river takes the better part of an hour, curving across the landscape, with the monument out of sight for most of it. Whatever ceremony took place at the stones, the journey to them was part of it. An hour of walking in a group, in procession, in whatever state of mind an hour of ceremonial walking produces, before the thing you have come for appears suddenly on the skyline. There is also a detail in the ground itself that has excited a great deal of comment. Running along the line of the avenue near the monument are natural ridges in the chalk, periglacial stripes formed by freeze-thaw processes at the end of the last ice age, and they happen to run exactly on the solstice axis. That is a coincidence of geology, not design. But it may not be a coincidence that the monument is here. If Neolithic people noticed that the earth itself was marked with lines pointing at the midwinter sunset, that would be an extremely powerful reason to regard this particular spot as significant. It is speculation, but it is disciplined speculation, and it offers something that had been missing. An answer to the question of why here, rather than anywhere else on a plain full of identical-looking ground. And the wider region was already full of people and monuments. Southern Britain in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC was one of the most heavily monumentalized landscapes in Europe. Long barrows for the dead, causewayed enclosures where communities gathered, henges, curses monuments running for kilometres across country. Avebury, a stone circle far larger in area than Stonehenge, lies about 30 kilometres north, along with Silbury Hill, the largest artificial mound in prehistoric Europe. This was not an empty wilderness with one strange ruin in it. It was a crowded ceremonial landscape, and Stonehenge was its most ambitious single building. Avebury deserves a moment of its own, since it is the natural comparison, and it makes a useful contrast. Its henge is vast. The bank and ditch enclose an area large enough that a village sits inside it today, with houses and a pub among the stones. And its stone circle is the largest in Britain by diameter. But the stones at Avebury are unshaped, large sarsens set upright as they were found, impressive by weight and number rather than by working. Two great monuments, 30 kilometres apart, built by related communities in overlapping centuries, and one of them decided to dress and joint and level its stones like a building while the other did not. Nobody knows why Stonehenge alone took that path. Avebury also has something Stonehenge does not. Silbury Hill, a couple of kilometres away, the largest artificial mound in prehistoric Europe, 40 metres high, built in stages around 2400 BC out of chalk and turf, containing something like 250,000 cubic metres of material. It has been tunnelled into repeatedly by people looking for the burial at its heart. There is no burial. There is no chamber, no body, no deposit of any kind that anyone has found. It appears to be a hill that people built because they wanted a hill, at a cost of millions of hours of labour, and it is one of the purest examples in Europe of monumental effort with no recoverable purpose whatsoever. The story of Stonehenge begins about 5,000 years before the first stone was raised, and it begins with something nobody expected to find. In the 1960s, work on the car park at the visitor site turned up a series of large pits. They were post holes, sockets that had held substantial upright timbers, pine trunks, perhaps 3/4 of a metre across. Radiocarbon dating placed them somewhere around 8000 BC, in the Mesolithic, 4,000 years before farming reached Britain and 5,000 years before the Stonehenge earthwork. 3 or 4 enormous posts, standing in a rough line, raised by hunter-gatherers on a spot that would become the most famous monument in Europe. The scale is worth registering. Pine trunks 3/4 of a metre in diameter are not saplings. Felling one with a flint axe is a substantial day's work for several people, and raising it upright requires digging a deep socket and organising a team. Mesolithic Britain is usually pictured as small mobile bands moving through forest, leaving almost nothing behind. These post holes are evidence of something else. A group who decided a particular place required marking, permanently, at real cost, 4,000 years before farming. There is a parallel worth mentioning, because it belongs to the same argument. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, hunter-gatherers were raising carved stone pillars in monumental enclosures around 9500 BC, before pottery, before agriculture, before permanent villages. That site rewrote the assumed sequence in which civilization was supposed to develop, and the Stonehenge car park post holes point, in a much smaller way, in the same direction. Monumental marking of places is older than farming, older than settlement, and appears to be one of the things human beings do as soon as they have any surplus capacity at all. Nobody knows what they were. Totem poles is the usual comparison, drawn from other hunter-gatherer societies. Markers of some kind, at any rate, and a considerable effort. Felling and shaping and raising pine trunks of that size with flint tools is not casual work. What matters is the implication. Something about this location was being singled out by people living in a Britain that was still largely forest, who had no agriculture, no pottery, no permanent settlements, and no connection at all to the farmers who would come along 4,000 years later. That is a very long memory for a place to have. And it opens the possibility that the Neolithic builders chose this spot because it already carried significance, carried down through an unimaginable span of time. Though the honest caveat has to be stated, 4,000 years is a very long gap. The populations involved were completely different, and there is no evidence of continuous activity at the spot in between. It is equally possible that both groups independently found the same place significant for the same underlying reason. The natural ridges pointing at the solstice, the position in the landscape, the sight lines, and that there is no memory involved at all, just two sets of people responding to the same ground. That reading is less romantic and probably more likely, but the post holes are there either way, and they mean that this was not a random patch of downland. Then came farming. Around 4000 BC, agriculture arrived in Britain, and with it, as ancient DNA has now shown decisively, the farmers themselves, people whose ancestry traces back through continental Europe to Anatolia, moving west across the continent over several thousand years, reaching Britain and largely replacing the hunter-gatherer population already there. Within a few centuries, the landscape began to change. Forest was cleared. Cattle and sheep appeared, and people started building. What they built first was not stone circles, but tombs. The long barrows of southern Britain are the earliest monumental architecture in the country. Elongated earthen mounds, often with stone or timber chambers, holding the bones of the dead. Sometimes many individuals, sometimes sorted and rearranged in ways that suggest the remains were handled and revisited over generations rather than simply buried. Then came causewayed enclosures, hilltop rings of interrupted ditches, meeting places where scattered communities gathered periodically for feasting, exchange, and ritual. And then, around 3500 BC, they built the curses. This is one of the least famous and most extraordinary things on Salisbury Plain. An enormous, elongated enclosure, nearly 3 kilometres long and about 100 metres wide, defined by a bank and ditch running east to west across the landscape just north of where Stonehenge would be built. It is not a settlement, not a field, not a tomb. It is a colossal linear space, and its purpose is entirely unknown. Processional route, boundary, arena, some kind of ceremonial course. What can be said is that it is enormous relative to anything else in the landscape, and that it required a great deal of digging with antler picks, and that its east-west orientation means it runs roughly along the line of the equinox sunrise and sunset, which may or may not be meaningful. A second, smaller cursus lies nearby. Both were built centuries before the first phase of Stonehenge, which means that when the builders came to choose a spot for their circular enclosure, they placed it just south of a monument that was already ancient, in a landscape that already had a grammar. It took an enormous amount of labour. It was old before Stonehenge existed. That is the world Stonehenge grew out of. A society of farmers, several centuries into occupying Britain, already building monuments on a scale that required organising hundreds of people, already treating this particular stretch of chalk downland as a place of the dead and of gathering. When the first ditch of Stonehenge was cut around 3000 BC, it was not an innovation appearing from nowhere. It was the latest project in a landscape that had been under construction for 1,000 years. The monument everybody pictures, the ring of great grey stones with lintels across the top, is not the first Stonehenge. It is the third or fourth, depending on how you count. The original was something quite different, a circular earthwork enclosing an empty space, and it stood that way for centuries. Around 3000 BC, people began cutting a circular ditch on the chosen spot, about 100 meters across, throwing the chalk up into a bank on the inside. The tools were antler picks, the shed antlers of red deer, which are hard, tough, and come free every year if you know where to look. Hundreds of them have been recovered from the ditch, discarded at the bottom where they were left, and they are one of the great gifts of the site to archaeology. Antler is organic, so it can be radiocarbon dated, and it was left in place by the diggers, so the dates are tight. Much of what we know about the chronology of Stonehenge comes from picks that Neolithic workers threw down when they broke. There is something quietly moving about that. The dating of the most famous monument in Europe rests substantially on the discarded tools of people who had no idea anyone would ever look, thrown into a ditch at the end of a shift because they were no longer any use. Archaeology is very often built out of what a society considered rubbish, and Stonehenge is a particularly pure example. The deliberate parts of the monument tell us almost nothing about when, and the litter tells us almost everything. The ditch was not dug in a smooth, continuous cut. It was excavated in segments by separate teams working stretches, which is a pattern found across British Neolithic earthworks and probably reflects how the labour was organised. Different family groups or communities each taking a portion, meeting in the middle. That is a small detail with a large implication. This was a collective project by multiple groups, not a workforce directed by a single authority. Just inside the bank, they dug the 56 Aubrey holes, evenly spaced around the circle. There has been long argument about what stood in them, with the current balance of opinion favouring stones. Quite possibly blue stones, brought from Wales at this very early stage, and set up in a ring before ever being rearranged into the forms we see now. If that is right, then the blue stones came first, and the famous Sarsens arrived 5 centuries later, which reverses the intuitive order and tells you something about which stones mattered most. And almost immediately, people began burying their dead there. Cremated remains were placed in the Aubrey holes and in the ditch. Not 1 or 2, but scores of them, deposited over a period of 500 years. Modern estimates put the number of individuals represented at somewhere upward of 150, which makes this one of the largest Neolithic cemeteries known in Britain, and the analysis of those remains has produced some of the most interesting recent findings about the site. So the first Stonehenge was a white chalk ring on the downland, ringed by upright stones, with the cremated dead of the community placed within it. Not a temple of the sun. A circular enclosure for the ancestors, built by farmers with deer antlers 500 years before anyone laid a lintel. Before the great stones arrive, it is worth staying with the dead, because the cremation cemetery is the part of Stonehenge that the popular picture leaves out entirely, and the part that has yielded the most human information. Cremated bone is difficult material. Burning destroys most of what archaeologists usually rely on. You cannot easily read age, disease, or diet from a handful of calcined fragments, and for most of the 20th century the Stonehenge cremations were regarded as more or less mute. Worse, many of them had been excavated in the 1920s and then, in an act that modern archaeologists describe through gritted teeth, reburied together in a single Aubrey hole, mixed up on the assumption that nothing further could ever be learned from them. Something further could. In the last 15 years, those remains have been re-excavated and subjected to techniques that did not exist when they were dug. Careful sorting, radiocarbon dating, and, most productively, strontium isotope analysis. Strontium enters the body through food and water, and its isotope ratios vary with the underlying geology of the place where a person lived. It is fixed in bone and teeth, and although cremation destroys a great deal, it does not erase the strontium signal in dense bone. The results were genuinely surprising. A significant proportion of the people buried at Stonehenge, something like 1/10 to 1/4 of those tested, had strontium signatures inconsistent with having lived on the chalk of Salisbury Plain. Their values point instead to Western Britain, with the Welsh uplands being the most obvious candidate, and in several cases the signal indicates they had lived there in the last decade or so of life. The technique has limits worth acknowledging. Strontium ratios identify a geological region rather than a place, and different areas with similar underlying rock can produce similar values, so the Welsh identification is a best fit rather than a certainty. Cremation also complicates the chemistry, and the specialists who did the work were careful about their claims. What survives all the caveats is the core finding. A meaningful proportion of the people buried at Stonehenge did not grow up on chalk, and the alternatives all lie well to the west. Which means people were being brought to Stonehenge from a great distance to be buried, from precisely the direction the bluestones came from. That coincidence of direction is the sort of thing that could be chance, and it should not be pushed too hard. But the pattern it forms with the other Western evidence, the Welsh quarries, the dismantled circle at Warne Morn, the animals driven from the west to the Durrington feasts, is consistent enough that a connection between Salisbury Plain and Western Britain runs through nearly every strand of this story. That single finding reframes the monument. Stonehenge was not merely a local cemetery for the communities of the plain. It was a burial place of sufficient importance that bodies, or the cremated remains of bodies, travelled hundreds of kilometres to reach it. Whatever the site meant, it meant it to people well beyond its own valley. The demographics are interesting too. The cremated remains include men and women in roughly equal numbers, and children as well as adults, which argues against the idea that Stonehenge was reserved for some narrow elite of priests or chiefs. Whoever was buried there, the criterion was not sex, and not simply age. Small numbers of objects accompany the burials: a mace head, some polished stone, a few items suggesting status. But nothing like the lavish grave goods that appear in Britain a few centuries later. These were substantial people, buried with ceremony, in a place that mattered, and there were a great many of them. One more finding from that work is worth noting because it bears on the whole story. The dating of the cremations shows that burial at Stonehenge was concentrated in the earlier phases, from around 3000 to 2500 BC, and tails off sharply after the Great Sarsens went up, which suggests that the monument changed function partway through its life. It began as a cemetery and became, once the enormous stone architecture was raised, something else. A place of ceremony and assembly rather than primarily of burial. The dead were still in the ground there. New ones largely stopped arriving. And that shift lines up with the change in the wider landscape. As burial at Stonehenge itself declines, the round barrows begin to spread across the ridges around it. The dead did not stop being important. They moved outside. From inside the circle to the horizon around it, and from collective cremation deposits to individual graves under their own mounds. The monument stayed at the centre, and the dead arranged themselves around it. Now to the strangest single fact about Stonehenge, and the one that has consumed more research effort than any other. Around 80 of the stones at Stonehenge, the blue stones, are not local. They are igneous rocks, spotted dolerite mostly, along with rhyolite and some sandstones, and their geological signature points to one specific place, the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, in the far southwest of Wales. The identification was made in 1923 by a geologist named Herbert Thomas, and it has been confirmed and refined repeatedly since. The distance from Preseli to Salisbury Plain in a straight line is around 225 kilometres. By any practical route, considerably more. Each bluestone weighs between roughly 1 and 4 tons. There are around 80 of them. Somebody moved them, or arranged for them to be moved, across southern Britain in the 3rd millennium BC. The comparison that makes the scale land is a modern one. If you wanted to replicate that journey today without machinery, you would be organising the movement of roughly 200 tons of rock across the width of a country, over ground with no roads, using ropes, timber, and human muscle, and doing it repeatedly, over years, through the territory of communities who had to agree to let you pass. It is a logistical operation that any modern project manager would find daunting with a budget and a fleet of trucks. For a long time, there was a serious alternative explanation, that the stones were not moved by people at all, but carried east by glaciers during an ice age and deposited near Salisbury Plain, where the builders simply found them lying about. This is not a crank theory. It was argued by competent geologists for decades, and if true, it would dissolve the whole problem. But the evidence has moved steadily against it. There is no good geological evidence that ice ever reached Salisbury Plain from that direction. No scatter of Preseli erratics has been found across the intervening landscape, which glacial transport would inevitably leave. Glaciers do not deliver a tidy consignment of 80 usable pillars to a single spot and drop nothing along the way. They smear material across an entire region, and no such smear exists, and decisively. Archaeologists have now found the quarries. That work, carried out over the past decade in the Preseli Hills, identified specific outcrops where stone was being extracted in the right period. At sites called Craig Rosy Felon and Carn Gaedog, excavators found the negative impressions where pillars had been levered out of the rock face, along with stone wedges, hammerstones, and artificial platforms built to receive the extracted pillars. And radiocarbon dates on charcoal and hazelnut shells from those working surfaces cluster around 3000 BC, the right moment for the earliest phase at Stonehenge. The rock at those outcrops matches specific bluestones at Stonehenge to a high degree of confidence. The detail that convinced most skeptics was mundane and decisive. At Craig Rosy Felon, a pillar was found still lying on the artificial platform built to receive it, extracted from the rock face and then, for whatever reason, never taken away. It is a bluestone that did not make the journey, sitting on the loading dock where it was left 5,000 years ago. You can stand next to it. The quarry is not an inference. It is a place where the work stopped and nobody tidied up. So the stones were quarried, deliberately, from particular outcrops in West Wales, and taken to Salisbury Plain. The Preseli dolerite naturally forms tall, pillar-like columns that split cleanly along vertical joints, which means they came out of the ground already shaped roughly like standing stones. That is presumably part of the attraction, but it does not explain choosing a source 225 kilometres away in a country where perfectly good stone lies everywhere. This is the question, and there are 3 serious answers, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is that the stones were valued for what they were. Preseli dolerite is distinctive. Dark, hard, flecked with white and pink feldspar crystals so that a wet stone looks spotted, almost starred. There are springs in the Preseli Hills that later folklore associated with healing, and one strand of interpretation holds that the bluestones were regarded as having curative or otherwise potent properties, so that hauling them across Britain was a way of importing the power of a sacred place. Supporting evidence is thin but suggestive. Many of the bluestones at Stonehenge show signs of having been chipped at by people over the centuries, apparently to take fragments away. which is consistent with a belief that pieces of the stone were valuable. The second is that the stones carried meaning as objects rather than as material. Specifically, that they were already a monument in Wales before they were a monument in England. This is the most dramatic recent hypothesis, and it came out of the same excavations that found the quarries. A few kilometres from Carn Gaedog lies a site called Warn Morn, where the remains of a large stone circle were identified. A circle around 110 metres in diameter, which is very nearly the exact diameter of the Stonehenge enclosure. Most of its stones are gone. The empty sockets that remain include at least one whose cross-section matches a particular bluestone at Stonehenge with striking precision, and the circle appears to have been dismantled at approximately the time Stonehenge was being built. Warn Morn also appears to have had a solstice alignment. If the interpretation holds, then the story is extraordinary. A community in West Wales took their own stone circle apart, carried it 225 kilometres and re-erected it on Salisbury Plain. Perhaps because they were migrating, perhaps as an act of political union with the communities there, perhaps for reasons we cannot recover. The monument would be, in a literal sense, an ancestral place transplanted. The hypothesis is contested. Other researchers have questioned the dating and the match, and it should be held as a strong possibility rather than a settled fact. But it fits the strontium evidence that people from Western Britain were being buried at Stonehenge, and it fits the sheer improbability of the effort. The third answer is that the effort was the point. Moving 80 stones across Britain is not an efficient way to obtain building material. It is an enormous, visible, collective undertaking requiring hundreds of people to cooperate over years. Anthropologists have long observed that monumental projects often function primarily as social technology. The building is what binds the builders. On this reading, the bluestones came from Wales precisely because Wales was far away, and the journey, repeated and remembered, was itself the thing being created. None of these can be proven. All three are plausible, and the truth may contain elements of each. Suppose you have decided to bring 80 stones from Wales. How is it actually done with Neolithic technology? There is no wheel available. The wheel does not appear in Britain until well after this period. There are cattle, and they can pull, but there is no evidence for the kind of heavy draft harnessing that would let a team of oxen haul multi-ton loads over rough ground. What there is: rope, timber, hundreds of people, and time. 2 broad routes have been proposed. The sea route takes the stones down to the Welsh coast, onto rafts or lashed canoes around the peninsula of southwest Wales, across the Bristol Channel, and then up the Bristol Avon and overland to Salisbury Plain. It has the appeal of moving the heaviest part of the journey onto water, where weight matters less. It has the disadvantage that the relevant stretch of sea includes some of the most dangerous tidal conditions in Britain, and that a raft losing a 4-ton stone loses it permanently. No bluestone has ever been found on that seabed or along that coast, which is an argument of a kind, though not a strong one, since finding such a thing would be luck. Experimental attempts have not helped the sea theory either. In 2000, a project to move a bluestone from Wales to Stonehenge by the proposed sea route ran into serious difficulty, and the stone ended up on the bottom of Milford Haven, having been lost from its raft. The experiment demonstrated something, though perhaps not what was intended, that the sea route is difficult enough that a modern team with modern equipment could not complete it. The land route runs east across South Wales and then southeast into Wiltshire, using river valleys where possible. It is longer in effort but far more controllable, and recent opinion has swung toward it, partly because the quarry excavations found artificial loading platforms suggesting stones were being transferred onto sledges rather than boats. The likely method on land is the one demonstrated repeatedly in experimental archaeology: a stone lashed to a wooden sledge dragged over a prepared trackway. Various trials have shown that a well-organized team can move a several-ton block this way at a reasonable pace. And one experiment produced a striking result, finding that a sledge running on a track of timber rails with a little water or grease requires far less effort than expected, with a modest team able to move a stone at walking speed. The technique is not the mystery. The organization is feeding, coordinating, and motivating enough people to do this repeatedly, over years, across the territory of communities who had to permit the passage. However it was done, the achievement stands. 80 stones, from a hill in Pembrokeshire to a chalk plain in Wiltshire, by people with rope and wood and their own bodies. It is one of the largest transport operations of prehistoric Europe, and it was carried out by farmers who had no metal, no wheels, and no state. The blue stones get the attention because they came furthest. But the Sarsens are the ones that make Stonehenge look like Stonehenge, and their story had a missing piece until very recently. Sarsen is a hard, silicified sandstone, formed as a surface crust over the chalk and broken up by later weathering into scattered blocks. Those blocks lie in fields across parts of southern England, and the traditional assumption was that the Stonehenge Sarsens came from the Marlborough Downs, around 30 kilometres north, where the greatest concentration of them survives. The so-called grey weathers, fields of grey boulders that from a distance look like resting sheep. But which part of that area, nobody knew, because Sarsen is chemically monotonous and stones from different places look identical. Then, in 2020, a piece of luck, a half-century old, paid off. During restoration work in 1958, a core had been drilled through one of the Sarsen uprights to allow a metal rod to be inserted, and the resulting cylinder of stone had been taken home by a man working on the project and kept for decades before being returned. That core gave researchers something they had never had: a sample of the interior of a Stonehenge Sarsen, unweathered, that they were permitted to destroy for analysis. Chemical fingerprinting of that core, compared against Sarsen samples collected from across southern England, produced a match. 50 of the 52 surviving Sarsens at Stonehenge share a chemical signature pointing to a specific area, West Woods, near Marlborough, about 25 kilometres north of the monument. For the first time, the source of the great stones was pinned down. That answer matters for the same reason as the Welsh quarries. It converts a general mystery into a specific logistical problem. 25 tons, 25 kilometres, uphill and down across chalk downland, roughly 30 times over. The route is broadly known now, and the labour estimates run into hundreds of people per stone, working over days for a project that would have consumed a great deal of a generation's surplus capacity. And 2 of the Sarsens do not match. They came from somewhere else, and nobody yet knows where. There is a related loose end that was tied up only very recently and made the problem stranger rather than simpler. The altar stone. A large recumbent slab at the heart of the monument, long grouped with the blue stones and assumed to come from South Wales, was reanalysed in the 2020s, and its mineral chemistry turned out not to match Welsh sources at all. The best match placed its origin in northern Scotland, some 750 kilometres away. If that holds, then one of the stones at the centre of Stonehenge travelled from the far north of Britain, which is 3 times the distance of the Welsh bluestones, and raises the whole question again in a much more difficult form. Even the solved problems on this site leave threads hanging. Getting a 25-ton block to the site is half the problem. Standing it upright, and then lifting another block on top of it, is the other half. And this is where Stonehenge separates itself from every other monument in prehistoric Britain. Start with shaping. The Sarsens were not used as found. They were dressed, worked over with hammerstones, hard rounded lumps of sarsen used as hand mauls, thousands of which have been found around the site. Pounding a stone of that hardness into shape is brutally slow work. Experimental estimates run to millions of blows per stone and many thousands of person-hours for the whole monument. The hammerstones themselves tell the story. They come in a range of sizes, from heavy two-handed mauls weighing tens of kilograms down to fist-sized stones for fine work, which indicates a graded process. Rough removal with the big ones, shaping with the medium, finishing with the small. They are found in their thousands around the stones and in the layers beneath, shattered and worn. Somebody's entire working life was spent hitting sarsen with sarsen, and the archaeological signature of that life is a scatter of broken hammers. The result is a set of stones with flattened faces, squared edges, and deliberate refinements. And, on close inspection, evidence that different stones were worked to different standards. The inward-facing surfaces of the trilithons are dressed far more finely than the outward faces, and the interior of the monument is generally better finished than the exterior. That is a meaningful choice. The effort went where it would be seen by people inside the circle. Whoever was meant to appreciate this building was standing in the middle of it, not looking at it from the plain. The uprights taper toward the top, and some show a slight swelling in the middle, which counteracts the visual narrowing that occurs when you look up at a tall column. That is a sophisticated optical correction, and the Greeks are usually credited with inventing it 2,000 years later. Then raising. The consensus reconstruction is straightforward in principle. Dig a pit with one vertical side and one sloping ramp, slide the stone down the ramp until its base drops into the socket, then haul it upright with ropes and A-frames, hundreds of people pulling, while others pack the socket with rammed chalk and stone. Excavation of the sockets has confirmed the shape, and the packing material is still in place around the stones today. Then the lintels, the genuinely difficult part. A 5 to 10 ton lintel has to be raised 4 meters and set precisely on 2 uprights without a crane. The favoured explanation is timber cribbing. Build a platform of interleaved logs beside the lintel, lever one end up a few centimetres, slide a timber underneath, lever the other end, repeat. Inching the whole block upward on a growing tower of wood until it reaches the required height, then slide it sideways into place. It is slow, entirely feasible, and requires only levers, timber, and patience. It has also been done. Experimental teams have raised replica lintels by exactly this method, and the technique appears in the historical record for moving heavy loads before cranes. The alternative proposal, building an earthen ramp and dragging the lintel up it, is possible but leaves problems. A ramp high enough to reach 4 meters would be a substantial construction in its own right, and no trace of such ramps has been found around the stone sockets, though 5,000 years of ploughing would not necessarily leave one. And then the joints, which are the detail that changes how you think about the builders. Each lintel is held by mortise and tenon, a knob left proud on the top of each upright, fitting a hollow cut in the lintel's underside. Adjacent lintels in the outer circle are joined to each other by tongue and groove. Those are woodworking techniques executed in stone, which strongly suggests the tradition grew out of the timber circles these communities had been building for centuries. They built in stone the way they knew how to build in wood. The outer lintels are also curved. Each one is shaped along its length so that the 30 lintels together form a true circle, and they were set level to within a few centimetres across the entire ring despite the ground sloping beneath. To achieve that, the builders had to establish a level horizontal plane across 100 meters of uneven downland, and then cut each upright to the height that plane required. That is surveying. Nobody has explained precisely how it was done with the tools available, and it remains one of the quiet marvels of the site. Not the size of the stones, but the flatness of the ring on top of them. The obvious candidate method is water. A trough or channel of water finds its own level over any distance, and a series of connected water-filled features could, in principle, establish a horizontal datum across the site. The technique was certainly used in the ancient Mediterranean and requires nothing that Neolithic Britain lacked. But there is no direct evidence for it here, and the honest position is that we know they achieved the result and can only guess at the method. Before leaving the structure itself, there is one more feature that deserves attention, partly because it is easy to miss on the ground, and partly because it produces the single most argued about claim in Stonehenge studies. Set just inside the bank, forming a rectangle around the central stone settings, were 4 small sarsens known as the station stones. 2 survive. The positions of the other 2 are known from their sockets. They are unremarkable to look at, modest upright blocks entirely overshadowed by the great stones inside them. And for a long time they were treated as incidental. They are not incidental. The rectangle they form has a peculiar property. Its short sides align on the solstice axis, and its long sides align on the extreme rising and setting positions of the moon. And that alignment only works at this latitude. Move the same rectangle a few hundred kilometers north or south, and the solar and lunar lines no longer meet at right angles. The geometry falls apart. Stonehenge sits, more or less, at the one band of latitude in the world where a rectangle can do both jobs at once. Whether the builders knew that, or stumbled into it, is unknowable. But it raises the lunar question, which is the most contested area of Stonehenge astronomy. The moon's behaviour is considerably more complicated than the sun's. Where the sun's rising point swings between 2 solstice extremes over a single year, the moon swings back and forth over a month, and the limits of that monthly swing themselves oscillate over a cycle of 18.6 years, between a period when the moon rises and sets across an unusually wide arc, and a period when it moves across a narrow one. That long cycle is called the lunar standstill, and detecting it requires sustained observation across decades by successive observers, with the results transmitted between generations. Several features at Stonehenge and in the surrounding landscape appear to reference lunar extremes, including the station stone rectangle and some of the early post holes at the northeastern entrance. And Stonehenge is not alone. Monuments elsewhere in Britain and Ireland show apparent lunar orientations, and one recumbent stone circle tradition in Scotland appears explicitly organised around moonrise. The maximalist reading, popular in the 1960s, held that Stonehenge was an astronomical computer capable of predicting eclipses using the 56 Aubrey holes as a counting device, a claim that made a great deal of noise and that most archaeologists now reject as reading far too much precision into a monument that was rebuilt repeatedly and whose stones have been reset in concrete in living memory. The episode is instructive about how these arguments go. The astronomical claims of the 1960s came largely from scientists rather than archaeologists, an astronomer and an engineer working with the coordinates of the stones and a computer, finding alignments in the numbers. Archaeologists objected that many of the alignments involved stones from different phases that never stood at the same time, that the error margins were generous enough to catch almost anything, and that with dozens of stones and dozens of astronomical targets, coincidental alignments are statistically inevitable. The debate was sharp and occasionally unpleasant, and the outcome was a general settlement. The solstice axis is real and deliberate, and the rest requires far more caution than the early claims allowed. It is worth adding that the episode did some good. The astronomical claims, however overstated, forced archaeologists to take prehistoric sky watching seriously, and the discipline of archaeoastronomy that emerged from the argument is now a legitimate field with proper statistical methods for distinguishing real alignments from coincidence. The maximalists were wrong about the eclipse computer and right that these people were watching the sky with care. The minimalist reading holds that the solar alignment is real and deliberate, the lunar material is ambiguous, and the rest is pattern matching. The honest middle is that these people watched the sky carefully over long periods, that at least one alignment is beyond dispute, that lunar interest is plausible and partially supported, and that the finer claims exceed what the evidence can bear. They were not running an observatory. They were unmistakably paying attention, and paying attention over generations, which is the harder part. A single lifetime is not enough to establish the 18.6-year lunar cycle with confidence. You need observations spanning several of them, which means the work had to be handed from one observer to the next across at least a century, with the results transmitted intact by people who could not write them down. Whether or not they achieved that, the fact that they might have is worth pausing on. It would represent a scientific program conducted entirely in memory. The stones are up. Before we walk out into the landscape that surrounds them, the story pauses here on a midwinter afternoon around 2500 BC with the monument new. It is the shortest day, and the light has been thin and grey since morning. Salisbury Plain in December is a cold place. The wind comes across the open downland without anything to break it. The grass is bleached and flattened, and the chalk shows white where the turf is worn along the tracks. There is frost in the hollows that has not lifted all day. Breath smokes. The stones stand in the middle of it, and they are new. Not the weathered, lichen-crusted grey of the photographs, but freshly dressed. The pounded surfaces pale and raw where the hammerstones have worked them, so that the whole structure is lighter than the landscape around it and catches what little light there is. That is a detail worth holding on to against every photograph you have ever seen. Stonehenge today is grey-brown and mottled with lichen, and it reads as ancient. New, it was pale. Freshly pounded sarsen surfaces are a light grey, almost white in places, standing inside a ring of bright white chalk on green downland. It would have been visible for kilometres, and it would have looked, to anyone approaching, like something manufactured rather than something geological. It was not a mysterious grey ruin. It was a brand new white building. The ring of lintels runs unbroken around the top. Inside, the 5 great trilithons rise in their horseshoe, and the tallest of them stands over 7 metres, the largest thing anyone in Britain has ever built. Its 2 uprights weigh around 50 tons together, and the lintel across them was raised more than 7 metres into the air. Nothing taller would be built in Britain until the medieval cathedrals, 3,500 years later. There are people, but not many, and they are quiet. Smoke is going up from somewhere beyond the bank, flattening and running away downwind. Somebody has come up the avenue from the northeast, walking the long curve of it, and the monument appeared over the crest the way it always does, all at once. Cattle are somewhere out on the plain, invisible in the failing light, and you can hear them occasionally when the wind drops. And then, in the middle of the afternoon, the sun comes down toward the horizon in the southwest, low and reddish through the winter haze, and lines up with the great central trilithon, and for a short while the light comes through the gap between the 2 tallest stones and lays a band of red gold along the ground the length of the monument. Everything else on the plain has gone blue and cold. That one line of warm light along the axis somebody surveyed a century before holds for a few minutes, and then the sun is below the ridge and it is gone, and the dark comes down very quickly as it does in December. There is a great quiet in that and a great rest. The year has reached its lowest point and turned. The people who built this thing had watched the light retreat for months and had made a place where the retreat could be seen to end. And whatever they believed about what happened next, the sun would come back, as it always does, a little further north each evening. Rest here a while, in the cold and the last of the light, with the new stones pale against the darkening plain and the smoke going flat in the wind and the year quietly turning over. Somewhere out beyond the bank a dog is barking, and the sound carries a long way across frozen ground. The rooks are going over toward their roost in a loose scatter, calling. The frost that never lifted is already hardening again in the hollows, and the chalk of the bank shows pale in the dusk like a ring of bone laid on the dark grass. Nothing needs to be understood. The light came down the axis and went out, and everyone went into the fires. Down at Durrington, the settlement is loud in the dark. Several hundred houses with their hearths going, smoke standing up in columns where the wind has dropped, the smell of roasting meat over the whole valley, and more people gathered in one place than exist anywhere else in Britain. Up here, there is nobody. The stones stand in the frost with the last of the daylight gone out of them, holding the line they were built to hold, waiting for a year to pass. Now the thing that most changes how Stonehenge should be understood, and that almost nobody encounters in the popular version. Stonehenge is not a monument. It is a component. Look at the surrounding landscape in an archaeological survey, and it is dense with construction. Within a few kilometres of the stones, there are hundreds of burial mounds, several major earthwork enclosures, at least 2 timber circles, a processional avenue 3 kilometres long, the enormous curses running east to west, and the remains of a settlement large enough to be called, without much exaggeration, the first great gathering place in British history. These are not scattered across millennia at random. Many of them are contemporary with each other, connected by alignments and pathways, and evidently designed to be experienced together. Start with the avenue, because it tells you how the monument was meant to be approached. It runs from the northeastern entrance of Stonehenge in a straight line for a few hundred metres, along the solstice axis, along those natural chalk ridges, and then swings east and curves down across the landscape for about 3 kilometres until it reaches the River Avon at a place called West Amesbury, where excavation has found the remains of a small stone circle at the river's edge. So the monument is connected by a formal, constructed route to the water. Now follow the river upstream a couple of kilometres, and you arrive at Durrington Walls, an enormous henge enclosure, some 500 metres across, one of the largest such structures in Britain. And Durrington has its own avenue running down to the same river on the same axis principle. 2 great monuments, a couple of kilometres apart, each linked by a ceremonial route to a stretch of the same river. And the river matters in its own right, not merely as a connector. Water is the standard boundary between worlds in a great many belief systems, and a procession that has to cross or travel along a river to get from the settlement of the living to the enclosure of the dead is describing that boundary physically. The Avon runs south from Durrington, and the Stonehenge Avenue meets it a couple of kilometres downstream, which means a journey between the 2 monuments by water travels with the current, downstream from the living toward the dead. Whether people actually made that journey by boat is unknown. There are no boats preserved from the site, though log boats of the period survive elsewhere in Britain. But the geometry is suggestive, and a procession travelling downstream on a midwinter afternoon from a settlement of hundreds of fires toward a silent stone enclosure on the hill would be a very effective piece of ritual theatre. That geography suggests a single designed complex, a place where processions moved between two centres by way of the water. And the excavation of Durrington walls carried out over the past 2 decades revealed what the second centre actually was, and it turned out to be the missing half of the Stonehenge story, the place where the builders lived. Inside the Great Henge at Durrington, archaeologists found houses. Small square buildings with chalk plaster floors, central hearths, and slots for wattle walls. The standard Neolithic house of the period. And there were a great many of them. The floors are the striking part. Chalk was beaten and compacted into a hard, pale surface, and around the central hearth the compaction is different where people knelt and sat and worked. In some houses the outlines of furniture are readable in the wear, and in at least one the impression of a box bed against the wall survives. These are ordinary domestic details from 2500 BC, preserved because the settlement was abandoned and covered rather than built over. The closest thing to a Neolithic living room that Britain possesses. Replicas of those houses have been built at the visitor centre using the same materials and dimensions, and they are one of the more effective things there. Small, dim, warm, smoky, with a fire in the middle and no chimney, the roof space thick with smoke that preserves the thatch. Standing inside one for a few minutes does more to convey Neolithic life than any amount of reading, mostly because of the smell. Estimates for the settlement run to several hundred dwellings, potentially housing something in the low thousands of people at its peak, which would make it by a wide margin the largest settlement known in Neolithic Britain and one of the largest in northwestern Europe. And the houses were not built to last. They were occupied briefly and repeatedly rather than continuously. The floors show relatively little accumulated wear, and the refuse pattern indicates intense short episodes rather than year-round living. This was a festival site, a settlement that filled with thousands of people for a period each year and then emptied, like a modern festival ground or a pilgrimage town out of season. For most of the year, several hundred empty houses stood on the bank of the Avon with nobody in them. The dating is the key. The houses cluster around 2500 BC, precisely the period when the great Sarsens were being raised at Stonehenge, 2 miles away. This is the builder's village. Finding it took a long time and a specific idea. Durrington walls had been known for decades and had been partly damaged by a road cut straight through it, and the interior was assumed to be more or less empty. The excavations that found the houses were undertaken as part of a research project working from the hypothesis that Stonehenge should be understood together with the monuments around it rather than in isolation. And the houses turned up because somebody went looking for the builders in the right place, having first worked out that there ought to be builders somewhere. And it was not an ordinary village. The refuse says so immediately. The floors and middens are packed with animal bone, overwhelmingly pig with a substantial amount of cattle, in quantities and in a condition that indicate feasting rather than daily subsistence. Joints of meat only partly eaten and discarded, bones with meat still attached, the pattern of a place where food was abundant to the point of waste. Analysis of the pig bones has found many animals killed at around 9 months of age, which for pigs born in spring puts the slaughter in midwinter. Then the isotopes, which produced the most remarkable finding of all. Strontium and oxygen analysis of the animal remains shows that the pigs and cattle eaten at Durrington were not raised locally. They came from all over Britain, from Western Britain, from Northern England, and in some cases from as far as Scotland. Animals were being walked hundreds of kilometres to be eaten at these gatherings. Consider what that involves in practice. Driving pigs any distance is notoriously difficult. They are not herd animals in the way sheep and cattle are. They do not travel well, and anyone who has tried to move them will tell you it is slow, frustrating work. Walking pigs from northern Britain to Salisbury Plain would take weeks, and the animals would lose condition on the way. It would be far more sensible to bring nothing and eat what your hosts provided, or to bring dried meat. That people instead walked live animals across an island suggests the animals mattered. That bringing your own contribution to the feast from your own place was part of the point. A gathering where everyone eats food from home is a very specific kind of social event, and it is not primarily about the food. Put that together, and a picture emerges that is unlike anything else in prehistoric Europe. At midwinter, people converged on Salisbury Plain from across Britain, from Wales, from the north, possibly from Scotland, driving their own livestock ahead of them, sometimes for weeks. They gathered in a temporary settlement of hundreds of houses. They feasted enormously. They moved in procession between the timber monument at Durrington and the stone monument at Stonehenge by way of the river. And, during some of those gatherings, they built. They raised the sarsens, hauled the lintels, and completed the most sophisticated structure in prehistoric Britain. Stonehenge, on this reading, was not built by a labour force. It was built by a festival, which also resolves a long-standing objection to the older reconstructions. 19th and 20th century writers, imagining slave gangs and despotic chiefs, could never explain where the coercive power came from, because no evidence of it exists anywhere in Neolithic Britain. The Durrington evidence supplies a mechanism that needs no coercion at all. People came voluntarily, in enormous numbers, for reasons that were their own. The feast, the meeting, the ceremony, the year's most important social occasion. And the construction happened because they were there. A recurring midwinter assembly that drew people from an entire island, and that used the gathering to do the work, which begins to answer the question of how a society without cities or kings or writing organized a project of this scale. It did not need a state. It needed a reason for everyone to come, and a time of year when the farming allowed it, and enough pigs. And that ordering is worth taking seriously, because it inverts an assumption that runs through a great deal of writing about early civilizations, that monumental architecture is a product of centralized power, and that finding one implies the other. Salisbury Plain suggests the relationship can run the other way, or not run at all. Here is a monument of enormous ambition produced by a society with no detectable hierarchy through a mechanism. The voluntary festival that requires no authority whatsoever. Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, 5,000 years earlier, points the same way. Hunter-gatherers building monumental architecture before agriculture, before cities, before anything that could be called a state. The link between monuments and kings may be much weaker than the pyramid model implies. Inside the Durrington enclosure, besides the houses, there were timber circles, rings of enormous posts. The largest of them a structure now called the Southern Circle, with concentric rings of uprights and an entrance avenue running down to the river. A little to the south stands Woodhenge, discovered from the air in the 1920s, another timber ring of 6 concentric oval settings of posts. The parallels with Stonehenge are exact enough to be deliberate. The Southern Circle at Durrington has an avenue to the river, like Stonehenge. It is solstice-aligned, like Stonehenge. But the alignments are mirrored. Stonehenge's principal axis is oriented to the midwinter sunset and the midsummer sunrise, while the Durrington Timber Circle is oriented to the midwinter sunrise and midsummer sunset. 2 monuments, 2 kilometers apart, connected by a river, facing opposite ends of the same solstice line. This produced one of the most influential interpretations in modern British archaeology, developed by Mike Parker Pearson, partly through conversation with a Malagasy archaeologist, Ramala Sanina, who was struck by how obvious the pattern seemed from the perspective of a culture where the distinction between materials is explicit. In Madagascar, timber is for the living and stone is for the ancestors. Houses are wood, tombs are stone, and the substitution of one for the other marks the passage from life to death. Apply that to Salisbury Plain, and the complex resolves into something coherent. Durrington Walls is the domain of the living. Timber circles, hundreds of houses, feasting, noise, the debris of occupation oriented to the sunrise. Stonehenge is the domain of the dead. Stone, no settlement, almost no domestic refuse, a cemetery of cremated remains oriented to the sunset. The river connects them, and the procession. Down the Durrington Avenue to the water, along or across the river, up the Stonehenge Avenue to the stones, is a journey from the world of the living to the world of the ancestors, made at midwinter, by people who had travelled from across Britain to make it. It is an interpretation, not a proven fact, and it rests on an ethnographic analogy from a different continent and a different millennium, which is a methodological move that requires care. The danger with ethnographic analogy is real and worth naming. Societies differ, and the fact that a modern culture on one continent associates stone with the dead does not establish that a prehistoric culture on another did the same. Used carelessly, the method can produce whatever the researcher expects to find. Used carefully, it does something more limited and more defensible. It supplies a hypothesis that can then be tested against the material. In this case, the hypothesis generated predictions, and those predictions were confirmed by excavation. If Durrington was the settlement of the living, it should contain houses and domestic refuse, and it did. That is the test that matters. But it accounts for the evidence better than any alternative on offer. The material contrast, the mirrored alignments, the river link, the presence of the dead in one place and the living in the other, the midwinter timing at both. And it turns Stonehenge from a puzzling object into the end point of a journey. Which brings us to the alignment itself, and to the most persistent misunderstanding about this monument. Every June, several thousand people gather at Stonehenge to watch the midsummer sunrise. They stand inside the circle looking northeast, out through the entrance, past the heelstone, and the sun comes up more or less over that stone, and it is a genuine alignment and a genuinely striking sight. Though even that is not quite as it appears. The heelstone stands slightly to one side of the true solstice axis, and the sun at midsummer rises a little to the left of it as seen from the centre, rather than directly above it. There is evidence that the heelstone once had a partner. A socket has been found beside it, in which case the sun would have risen in the gap between the two, framed rather than crowned. The photograph everyone has seen, with the sun balanced on top of the heelstone, is taken from a position chosen to produce that effect. It is also, on the best current understanding, facing the wrong way. The axis of Stonehenge is a line, and a line has two ends. Looking northeast along it, you get the midsummer sunrise. Looking southwest along it, you get the midwinter sunset. The sun going down at the year's lowest point, in the gap of the great central trilithon, exactly as described a moment ago. And that trilithon was built to frame it precisely. Its two uprights stood closer together than any other pair in the monument, leaving a narrow vertical slot rather than a broad opening. A deliberate aperture, not a gap left by convenience. One of those uprights fell at some point and broke. Its stump is still in place and the fallen upper portion lies where it landed. When the monument was whole, the midwinter sun would have descended into a tall, narrow gate of stone at the heart of the structure, watched by people standing inside the ring. Both are real. The question is which one the monument was designed around, and several independent lines of evidence point to midwinter. First, the structure itself. The tallest and most elaborate part of the monument is the great trilithon at the southwestern end, which frames the midwinter sunset. A viewer inside the circle at midsummer sunrise is looking outward through the entrance, away from the monument's own architecture. A viewer at midwinter sunset is looking into and through its greatest feature. The building emphasizes the winter end. Second, the approach. The avenue arrives from the northeast, which means a procession walks toward the monument along the line of the midwinter sunset, moving with the axis rather than against it, entering the circle facing southwest toward the setting sun of the shortest day. Third, and most decisively, the pigs. The feasting evidence at Durrington points to midwinter slaughter. If the great gatherings on this landscape occurred in December rather than June, then the ceremonies these monuments were built for happened at midwinter, and the alignment that mattered was the one visible then. None of this makes the midsummer alignment accidental. Building the axis puts both events in place automatically, and the builders certainly knew it. But the weight of the evidence is that Stonehenge is a midwinter monument, and that the modern association with midsummer is an artifact of the last few centuries, driven by the simple fact that June in England is a much more agreeable month to stand outside in at 4 a.m. than December. There is also a documentary reason. The 18th century antiquarians who first drew serious attention to the alignment noted the midsummer sunrise, and their descriptions shaped everything that came afterward. Stukely wrote about it, the Romantics repeated it, and by the time organised gatherings began at the site in the 20th century, midsummer was simply the established date. Nobody chose it against the evidence. The evidence for midwinter primacy mostly arrived in the last few decades, by which point June had a century of tradition behind it. If the monument is about midwinter, the next question is why that moment mattered so much to a farming society in Northern Europe. And here the answer is less mysterious than it might appear, though it takes some effort to feel it properly from the inside of a heated house. Consider the position. You are a farmer on Salisbury Plain around 2500 BC. Your survival depends on crops that grow in a season and on animals that must be fed through a winter. From midsummer onward, every day is shorter than the last. The sun rises further south and climbs less high. The light fails earlier, the cold comes, the grass stops growing, and the stored fodder starts running down. This continues relentlessly for 6 months. There is no calendar on a wall and no confidence, in the way a modern person has confidence, that the process will stop. What there is instead is the accumulated observation of generations recorded in the landscape, that when the sun reaches a particular point on the horizon, it stops going south and begins to come back. That moment is the hinge of the year, and it is the single most important astronomical event for anyone whose life depends on the growing season. Midsummer is pleasant. Midwinter is existential. The word solstice means literally sun standing. The point where the sun's movement along the horizon halts before reversing, and marking that point precisely, in stone, permanently, in a way that could be verified year after year, is exactly what a society with everything staked on the return of the light might build. And there is a second layer, harder to evidence but consistent with everything else on this landscape. Midwinter is the death of the year and its rebirth in the same moment. the darkest point, immediately followed by the return. A monument that is also a cemetery, connected by a processional route to the settlement of the living, aligned on precisely that hinge and used for gatherings held at precisely that time, fits together into something coherent. The dead and the dark and the turning are the same subject. And that pairing is not peculiar to Britain. Midwinter festivals cluster across the northern hemisphere wherever the winters are long enough to be frightening. The Roman Saturnalia, the northern European Yule, and eventually the placement of Christmas itself at the solstice rather than at any date supported by the sources. The details of that placement are argued over by historians, and it is not a simple story of one festival replacing another, but the broad point stands. The Northern European calendar has a heavy midwinter festival at its centre, and it has had one for as long as we can see back, and Stonehenge is part of that record. The instinct to mark the turn of the light with feasting, fire, gathering, and thoughts of the dead is one of the oldest continuous human patterns we can trace, and Stonehenge is one of its earliest surviving monuments. The impulse behind a midwinter gathering on Salisbury Plain in 2500 BC and a midwinter gathering in a modern living room is not obviously different. We cannot recover the theology. But we can say that these people built an instrument for observing the return of the light and put their ancestors inside it and held a midwinter festival there that drew an island's worth of people and livestock. And that whatever they believed, it was serious enough to justify 400 years of construction. That last point is the one that should stay with a listener. Belief is cheap to profess and expensive to act on, and the archaeological record is a record of what people were willing to pay for. These communities paid in labour and food and risk and time across 16 generations for something with no practical return whatsoever. No defensive value, no agricultural value, no economic yield. Whatever they thought was happening at midwinter on that plain, they thought it mattered more than almost anything else they could have done with the same effort. Before leaving the surrounding country, one more element deserves attention because it dominates the landscape visually and is usually mistaken for background scenery: the barrows. Salisbury Plain around Stonehenge is covered in burial mounds. There are hundreds of them within a few kilometres, and they are not randomly scattered. They cluster along ridge lines with clear sight lines to the monument, forming what look like deliberate cemeteries positioned to be seen from, and to see, the stones. Some are earlier long barrows from the 4th millennium. Most are round barrows of the early Bronze Age, built in the centuries after the Great Sarsen phase, when the monument was standing and in use, but no longer being extended. The two forms say different things. A long barrow is a communal tomb, often used over generations, its chamber reopened to add new dead and rearrange the old. Bones sorted by type in some cases, skulls in one place and long bones in another, the individual dissolving into the collective ancestry. A round barrow is a single grave with a mound on top. One person, one moment, one act of commemoration. The landscape holds both, separated by 1,000 years, and walking from one group to the other is walking across a change in what a person was understood to be. That distribution says something specific. For centuries after Stonehenge was completed, people continued to want their dead placed within sight of it. The monument had become the anchor of a sacred geography, and proximity to it was worth arranging your funeral around. There is a visible logic in the placement, too. The barrows sit on the horizon lines as seen from the monument, on the crests of the low ridges rather than in the hollows, which means they were positioned to be visible from Stonehenge and to have Stonehenge visible from them. Somebody was standing at each proposed site, checking the sight line before the mound went up. The result is that a person standing at the stones in about 1800 BC would have been ringed by the graves of the important dead of the previous several centuries, all of them arranged around the horizon like an audience. There are around 350 barrows within a 3-kilometre radius of the stones. Some stand alone, many are in linear cemeteries of 5, 10, 15 mounds strung along a ridge, built in sequence over generations so that each new one joined a line already there. Walking those ridges today, the mounds are low, green swellings in arable fields, ploughed down over centuries and easy to miss. From the air they are unmistakable, and the pattern they make around the monument is one of the clearest things in British archaeology. And some of those burials were spectacularly rich. The most famous is Bush Barrow, excavated in 1808 on a ridge less than a kilometre from the stones, which held a man laid out with an extraordinary set of objects: bronze daggers, a stone mace head with a shaft decorated in bone mounts, and 2 sheets of gold. One, a large lozenge-shaped plate of astonishing craftsmanship, worked with fine geometric decoration in lines so precise that examination has suggested the use of a tool held in a fixed guide, at a level of accuracy that would be difficult by eye. The lozenge is worth dwelling on because of what it implies about skill. It is a thin sheet of gold, roughly the size of a hand, worked with a pattern of nested lozenges and fine parallel lines. Thousands of them, cut so evenly that analysts have estimated the spacing is consistent to a fraction of a millimetre across the whole surface. Whoever made it was working at the limit of what an unaided eye can resolve on a material that punishes a slipped tool in about 1900 BC. Britain in that period had no cities and no writing, and it had a goldsmith capable of that. That burial is roughly contemporary with the later use of Stonehenge, and it belongs to a period when the society had changed considerably from the one that dug the first ditch. Wealth is now concentrated in individuals. Gold appears, metal appears. A man is buried alone under his own mound with objects that no one else has, which is a completely different social statement from a cremation cemetery holding 150 people together inside a circle. The transition can be read almost as a sequence on this one landscape. First, collective burial. Bones of many individuals mingled in long barrows, or cremated remains placed together inside a communal enclosure, with no single person marked out. Then, individual burial with grave goods, one body laid out with possessions under a mound raised specifically for them. The archaeology of Salisbury Plain records, in the ground, the moment when these societies began to hold that some people were more important than others in a way that ought to remain visible after death. Something shifted on this landscape between 3000 and 2000 BC, and the barrows record it. From the collective dead of the enclosure to the singular dead beneath their own hills, from communal ancestors to named chiefs. The monument stayed where it was while the society around it became something new. We have walked out across the whole landscape now. The avenue, the river, the village of the builders, the timber circles, the mounds along the ridges. Before we ask who these people were, the story pauses again at the end of a day in early summer out on the plain. The light is going long and gold across the downland, the way it does in June in southern England when the day has been fine and the evening stretches out. The grass has grown up since spring and it moves in slow waves when the breeze comes through, and it is full of small flowers. The chalk downland flora, low and fine, scattered white and yellow and pale purple through the green. There are skylarks somewhere overhead, invisible, going on and on the way they do until the light finally fails. The stones stand a little way off, catching the low sun on their western faces, the shadows of the trilithons stretching out enormously across the turf toward the east. Nobody is at the monument this evening. It is not the season for gathering. The people are away at their farms and their herds through the growing months, and the plain is empty and quiet and warm. Somewhere out of sight, a cart track runs across the down, and the ruts in it are old. There are sheep on the far slope, small and white and slowly moving. Everything smells of warm grass. Out along the ridges, the round mounds of the barrows stand in their lines, each one holding somebody, each one placed where the stones can be seen. Their shadows are lengthening too. Below, in the valley, the river runs slow between its banks, and the water has that flat, coppery look it takes on in the last hour, and there are insects over it in clouds, and the swallows working through them. It is one of the most ordinary evenings imaginable, and it has happened here, in some form, every summer for 5,000 years. There is a particular quality to English summer light in the late evening at this latitude that people who live elsewhere find strange. It goes on and on, the sun setting slowly at a shallow angle so that the last hour before dark stretches out unreasonably, everything gold and lengthening, the shadows travelling visibly across the ground. That light has been doing this on this plain since long before there were stones on it. The stones stood through all of them, through the centuries when people came in their thousands at midwinter, and through the centuries afterward when nobody came at all, and through every quiet June evening in between when the shadows went out across the grass and the larks sang and there was nothing to see. Rest here a while in that. The work is done for now. The gathering is months away. A hare gets up out of the grass a little way off and lopes 20 paces and stops and sits, listening, then goes on. There are sheep somewhere down the slope, and the small sound of them carries in the still air. The turf underfoot is warm from the day, and it smells of dry grass and thyme and the chalk beneath. Far off, a cuckoo is calling from the trees along the river valley, the sound arriving flattened by distance and repeating at intervals. The shadows of the trilithons have reached most of the way across the enclosure now and are still lengthening. Nothing is happening, and nothing needs to. The light is going gold and long across the plain, and the stones are standing in it, and the whole landscape is doing what it does for most of its history, which is simply lying there in the evening, being beautiful with nobody watching. That is the true condition of nearly every monument, and it is worth holding on to against the way we usually picture the past. The ceremonies were rare. The gatherings were once a year at most. Every other day, for 4,500 years, the stones have simply stood in the weather with nothing happening. Through 10,000 ordinary June evenings and 10,000 wet Februaries, with sheep grazing round them and nobody there at all. The monument spends almost all of its existence being ignored, and that is not a failure of the monument. It is what standing means. Stonehenge is the most famous stone circle in the world, and it is deeply misleading about stone circles generally, because it is not typical of anything. It is worth spending a few minutes on its neighbours and relatives, both to see what the standard version looked like and to see how strange Stonehenge actually is. There are roughly 1,000 stone circles in Britain and Ireland. They were built over a span of about 2,000 years, from the late Neolithic into the Bronze Age, and they occur from Cornwall to Orkney. The overwhelming majority are modest, rings of unshaped local stone, a few dozen metres across, standing to head height or less, built by local communities with local materials. They are found in upland areas particularly, often near settlements and field systems, and most of them attract no visitors at all. A person could walk into a field in Cumbria or Aberdeenshire tomorrow and stand alone inside a 5,000-year-old stone circle for as long as they liked. Castlerigg, in the Lake District, sits in a natural amphitheatre of mountains and is free to enter at any hour. Swinside, a few valleys away, requires a walk-up, a farm track, and is almost always empty. Long Meg and her daughters in the Eden Valley includes a tall outlying stone carved with spiral and ring designs older than the circle around it. Any of them would be world famous if it were the only one. Some of them are extraordinary in their own right. The Ring of Brodgar and the Stones of Stennis in Orkney, in the far north of Scotland, belong to a ceremonial complex that predates Stonehenge. And nearby, at the Ness of Brodgar, excavation has revealed a monumental building complex of a scale and sophistication that has forced a rethinking of where innovation in Neolithic Britain came from. The old assumption was that ideas flowed outward from the wealthy south. The Orkney evidence suggests that in this period, the far north was leading, and that a distinctive style of pottery and monumental architecture spread from there southward. The Ness of Brodgar site is worth a sentence on its own. A complex of large stone buildings with thick walls, paved passages, decorated stonework, and coloured pigment on the masonry, occupied for something like 1,000 years, and then deliberately closed down with a feast involving hundreds of cattle. It sits between two stone circles on a narrow strip of land between two lochs in Orkney at the northern edge of Britain, and it was built before Stonehenge. Callanish, on the Isle of Lewis, is a cruciform arrangement of tall, thin gneiss stones on a ridge above a sea loch, aligned in ways that appear to reference the moon's extreme southern rising, which at that latitude produces a spectacular effect once every 18.6 years when the moon skims the horizon along a distant ridge shaped like a reclining figure. Avebury, as we have seen, is vastly larger in area than Stonehenge, with a bank and ditch enclosing a village, an enormous outer circle, two inner circles, and a stone avenue running 1.5 miles across country. It is nearby, roughly contemporary, and completely different in character. Massive, unshaped, sprawling, and open, where Stonehenge is compact, precisely worked, and enclosed. Set against all of that, the peculiarity of Stonehenge becomes clear. It is the only stone circle anywhere with shaped and dressed stones. The only one with lintels. The only one with carpentry joints. The only one where the stone was brought from hundreds of kilometres away when local material was available. The only one built with a continuous ring of horizontal stone in the air. That last feature deserves emphasis because it is easy to say and hard to picture. 30 upright stones, each carrying 2 lintel ends, with every lintel curved along its length and jointed to its neighbours, forming a closed circle of stone suspended 4 metres above the ground and level all the way round. Nothing else like it was built anywhere in Europe for another 2,000 years, when the Greeks began putting stone architraves on colonnades. Whether the Stonehenge builders had any idea how unusual what they were doing was, is unknowable, but there was nothing on the island to compare it to. Every other circle in Britain is a ring of stones. Stonehenge is a piece of architecture that happens to be circular. Nobody knows why this one site received that treatment. But it is worth noticing that the strangeness of Stonehenge is not that Neolithic Britons built stone circles. They built 1,000 of them, routinely, all over the islands. The strangeness is that at this one place they decided that a stone circle was not enough. And whatever prompted that decision, it happened here and nowhere else, in a single place, at a single period, and was never repeated. There is no second Stonehenge anywhere in the world. Whatever combination of ambition, resources, religious conviction, and social circumstance produced it occurred once. Now to the people, because the last decade has transformed what can be said about them, and what it revealed is stranger than the folklore it replaced. The builders of the first Stonehenge were Neolithic farmers, and ancient DNA has now established where they came from with real precision. Farming reached Britain around 4000 BC, and it came with people. Populations descending ultimately from the first farmers of Anatolia, who spread across Europe over several millennia by two broad routes, one along the Mediterranean and one up the Danube. The British Neolithic population shows a strong signal from the Mediterranean route, arriving via Iberia and France. When they got here, they largely replaced the existing hunter-gatherer population of Britain. The genetic contribution of the earlier inhabitants to the Neolithic gene pool is small. These were the people who cleared the forests, built the long barrows, dug the causewayed enclosures, raised the cursus, and cut the first ditch at Stonehenge. They kept cattle and pigs, grew wheat and barley, lived in scattered farmsteads, and gathered periodically at monuments. Their diet is readable from their bones and their pots, substantial amounts of dairy. Britain has some of the earliest evidence anywhere for milk use, with residues preserved in Neolithic pottery, along with beef and pork, cereals, hazelnuts, and remarkably little fish. That last point has puzzled researchers for years. These were people living on an island with abundant coastal resources, whose hunter-gatherer predecessors had eaten a great deal of seafood, and who appear to have almost entirely abandoned it in favour of farmed food. Something cultural seems to have been going on. Fish was available, and they largely did not eat it. The usual explanation is that farming arrived as a package, a way of life with its own norms about what constitutes proper food. And that fish came to be marked as something the previous people ate, and therefore not something farmers did. If that is right, it is one of the earliest detectable food taboos in European prehistory, and it lasted for most of the Neolithic. They had no metal until late in the sequence, no writing, no cities, and no evident kings. And that last point is worth dwelling on, because it makes the achievement peculiar. Stonehenge required the coordination of hundreds of people over centuries. Elsewhere in the world, that kind of coordination comes with a state. Egypt had a pharaoh, Mesopotamia had kings and temples and bureaucrats, and the writing to run them. Neolithic Britain had none of that. There are no palaces, no royal burials from this period, no administrative apparatus, no evidence of a coercive hierarchy. The contrast with Egypt at the same moment is instructive rather than embarrassing. The Great Pyramid was rising within a century or two of the Stonehenge Sarsens, and it was the product of a unified state with a god-king at its head, a bureaucracy that recorded rations for the workforce, a professional administrative class, and a river that could float multi-ton blocks to the site. Stonehenge was built by farming communities with none of those things, in a wetter and poorer country, using stones that had to be dragged overland. The Egyptian achievement is larger. The British one is, in a certain sense, harder to explain. The society that built the most sophisticated monument in prehistoric Europe appears, as far as archaeology can tell, to have been relatively egalitarian, which forces a reconsideration of how such things get built. The Durrington evidence suggests the mechanism, not a workforce compelled by an authority, but a periodic gathering that people chose to attend, drawn by feasting, ceremony, exchange, and the social business of an entire island meeting in one place. The construction was something the assembly did while it was assembled. That is a completely different model of monumental building from the pyramid model, and Stonehenge may be its finest surviving example. It is also worth noting that the two models produce different kinds of monument. Coerced labour under a centralised state produces scale and speed. The Great Pyramid went up in roughly 2 decades. Voluntary assembly produces something slower and stranger. 1,500 years of episodic construction, phases that contradict each other, stones moved and moved again. A monument that was never finished because nobody was ever in a position to declare it finished. Stonehenge looks the way it does partly because no single authority ever decided what it should be. They were also, on the evidence of their work, extremely capable. They understood solstice geometry well enough to lay out an axis that still works. They surveyed a level plain across uneven ground. They transported stones across Britain. They imported carpentry joints into masonry. Whatever primitive means, it does not apply to the people who did this. It is worth being concrete about the intellectual demands. To lay out the solstice axis, you must observe over years, average your observations, and translate them into a permanent ground line. To dress the Sarsens, you must understand how that particular stone fractures under repeated blows. To fit the lintels, you must plan joints in 3 dimensions before cutting. To level the ring, you must establish a horizontal datum across 100 meters of sloping ground. To transport the stones, you must organize the food, the ropes, the labor rotation, and the route. Every one of those is a specialist skill, and the whole thing had to be coordinated by people who could not write anything down. The knowledge lived entirely in trained minds and in apprenticeship, which means the society also had to be stable enough to keep teaching it for 400 years. 400 years is roughly 16 generations. For comparison, 16 generations before the present takes you back to the early 16th century. A tradition of stoneworking, surveying, and ceremonial practice sustained by word of mouth and demonstration across that span, in a society without writing, cities, or a state, is an achievement of social organization at least as impressive as the physical monument it produced. And then, around 2500 BC, at almost exactly the moment the great Sarsens were going up, something happened to the population of Britain that nobody suspected until ancient DNA made it visible, and that ranks among the more startling findings in European archaeology. New people arrived. They are known archaeologically by the distinctive pottery they carried, a decorated drinking vessel found across a huge swathe of Europe, which gives them their conventional name, the beaker culture. They came from the continent, and their genetic ancestry traces back through Central Europe to the steppe populations north of the Black Sea, who had themselves expanded west a few centuries earlier. That steppe expansion is one of the largest events in European prehistory, and it deserves a sentence in its own right, because it reshaped the continent. Beginning around 3000 BC, populations from the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, herders with wheeled vehicles, horses, and a pastoral economy, moved west across Europe in a process that, within a few centuries, had transformed the genetic makeup of much of the continent and is widely believed to have carried the Indo-European languages with it, ancestral to most of the languages spoken in Europe today, including English. The people who arrived in Britain around 2500 BC were the western edge of that wave. They brought metalworking, a new burial practice of individual graves with grave goods, and a different way of organizing society. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists debated whether the spread of beaker material culture represented migrating people, or simply a fashion in pots and practices spreading between existing populations. Ancient DNA settled it for Britain, and the answer was uncompromising. Studies analysing genomes from British burials before and after 2500 BC found that within a few centuries, something like 90% of the genetic ancestry of the population had been replaced. The Neolithic farming population, the people who built Stonehenge, were, genetically speaking, almost entirely displaced. That figure is startling enough that it needs care in interpretation. It also needs care because of how such findings can be misused. Population replacement results from ancient DNA have been seized on by people looking for narratives about conquering peoples and racial displacement, and the researchers who produce them are generally at pains to point out what the data does and does not show. What it shows is a change in the frequency of genetic markers across a few centuries. It does not show armies, or intent, or any of the things a nationalist reading wants. Prehistoric populations moved, mixed, and replaced one another constantly in every direction, everywhere on Earth. The Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge had themselves largely replaced the hunter-gatherers before them, and both were long gone before anything that could be called a nation existed. It does not necessarily mean violence or invasion in the way an old-fashioned account might have imagined. Population turnover on that scale can result from differential reproduction, from disease, from gradual demographic swamping over 10 or 15 generations, or from combinations that leave no trace of conflict in the archaeological record. There is, notably, no evidence of a war. And some Neolithic ancestry persists, particularly in certain regions. But the fact stands, and its implication for Stonehenge is remarkable. The monument was still in use after the turnover. The blue stones were rearranged, burials continued in the landscape, the barrows multiplied. Which means that for much of its later life, Stonehenge was being maintained and used by people who were not descended from the people who built it. Think about what that means. A monument whose construction spanned 1,500 years outlived its own builders as a population. Whatever it meant to the Neolithic farmers who cut the first ditch, it must have meant something different to the Beaker-descended communities who were arranging their dead around it 1,000 years later. The stones stayed, the people changed, the meaning migrated. That is a pattern familiar from cathedrals and temples everywhere. A structure surviving into a world that understands it differently, but rarely can it be documented so precisely. And it raises a question with no answer. Did the incoming Beaker communities learn what the monument was for from the people they replaced? Was there a transitional period of shared use, with knowledge passed across? Or did the newcomers simply inherit an impressive structure whose purpose they reconstructed to suit themselves? The archaeology shows continuity of use and change of practice, which is consistent with either. Somewhere in the centuries around 2400 BC, a body of religious knowledge either transferred between populations or quietly failed to. One burial captures that new world better than any general account, and it was found by accident in 2002 during work for a housing development at Amesbury, a few kilometres from Stonehenge. The grave held a man of about 35 to 45, buried with the richest set of grave goods known from Beaker period Britain: 5 beaker pots, 3 copper knives, boar tusks, a stone wrist guard of the kind used by archers, 16 barbed and tanged flint arrowheads, and, most significantly, 2 small gold ornaments among the earliest gold objects ever found in Britain. They are small. A pair of basket-shaped ornaments, probably hair ornaments or earrings, made of thin sheet gold rolled and worked. Their significance is out of all proportion to their size. They mark the arrival in Britain of a material that would organise elite display for the next 3,000 years, and their appearance in the grave of a man who grew up in the Alps ties that arrival directly to continental contact. Beside him, in a nearby grave, was a younger man who shared with him an unusual inherited foot bone condition, indicating a close family relationship. The press named him the Amesbury Archer, and then the isotope analysis turned him into something more interesting. The oxygen and strontium ratios in his tooth enamel, which record the water he drank as a child, do not match Britain. They indicate that he grew up in a colder climate, in a region most consistent with the Alps, Central Europe, quite possibly around what is now Switzerland, Austria, or southern Germany. He travelled at some point in his life across the continent and the Channel, and ended up buried within sight of Stonehenge with more wealth than anyone else in Britain. He also had a knee injury that had left him with a serious infection and a leg that would have been painful and stiff for years, and he had lost several teeth to an abscess. The knee had been damaged badly enough that the kneecap was gone entirely, and the bone had been left with a persistent infection that would have discharged and smelled. He walked with a considerable limp for years, and he lived. Which itself says something, since a chronic bone infection in that period was survivable only with sustained care from other people. Somebody looked after him. This was a man who had made an extremely long journey in considerable discomfort. What he represents is debated. He may have been a metal worker. The copper knives and the timing suggest someone connected to the arrival of metallurgy in Britain, and in a society encountering metal for the first time, a person who could make it would be regarded with something close to awe. He may have been a person of rank moving through a network of elites that stretched across Europe. He may have come specifically because of Stonehenge, which by then was already ancient and may already have had a reputation abroad. That last possibility is worth taking seriously. By 2300 BC, the Great Sarsens had been standing for 2 centuries, and the site had been in use for 7. In a world without writing, information still travelled, carried by traders, by migrants, by the people who moved copper and gold across Europe. And a structure of that size and strangeness in a well-connected corner of the continent would have been talked about. The archer's grave is not the only continental burial near the monument, and the pattern of rich foreign graves in its vicinity suggests that people were coming to be near it. Stonehenge may have been a destination from very early on. A cluster of burials found at Boscombe Down, a few kilometres away, includes a group of men whose isotope signatures point to origins outside southern England, possibly Wales, possibly further afield, buried together in a way that suggests a family or a travelling group. They are known as the Boscombe Bowmen. Whoever they were, they had come from somewhere else and ended up here, in the ground beside the most remarkable structure in Britain. What is certain is that by 2300 BC, Salisbury Plain was connected to continental Europe in a way that the Neolithic landscape was not, that individuals could travel 1,000 kilometres and be honoured at the end of it, and that the world of collective cremation burials inside a chalk enclosure had given way to a world of rich individual graves. The archer was buried near the stones by a society that had inherited them. Now to the belief that will not die, and to how it started, because the answer says a great deal about how the past gets constructed. The Druids were real. They were a priestly class among the Iron Age Celtic peoples of Britain, Gaul, and Ireland, described by Greek and Roman writers, notably Julius Caesar, who recorded that they conducted rituals, adjudicated disputes, taught orally, and held a doctrine of the soul's survival. They existed. They mattered. They are also entirely irrelevant to Stonehenge. It is worth adding that what we know about them is thin and mostly hostile. The Druids left no writings of their own. Caesar says explicitly that their doctrine was forbidden to be written down. So every ancient account of them comes from Greek and Roman authors describing a people their armies were in the process of conquering. Caesar's Druids conduct human sacrifice in wicker figures. Later writers add sacred groves and grisly rites. How much of that is observation, and how much is the standard vocabulary of imperial propaganda about barbarians is genuinely unclear. The historical Druids are a real institution, glimpsed almost entirely through the eyes of their enemies, which is another reason to be careful with them. The chronology is not close. Stonehenge's construction ended around 1500 BC. The Druids appear in the historical record in the last centuries BC, more than 1,000 years later, and roughly 1,500 years after the Great Sarsens were raised. The gap between the completion of Stonehenge and the first Druid is comparable to the gap between the fall of Rome and the present day. There is no plausible line of continuity, and there is no archaeological evidence that Iron Age people used Stonehenge in any significant ceremonial way at all. So where did the belief come from? From two 17th and 18th century antiquarians working in good faith with almost no information. The first was John Aubrey in the 17th century, who surveyed the monument, discovered the pits that now carry his name, and reasoned as follows. This monument is clearly pre-Roman. The only pre-Roman British priesthood documented in ancient literature is the Druids. Therefore, this was probably a Druid temple. Given what was available to him, it was not an unreasonable inference. There was no archaeology, no radiocarbon dating, no way to establish that anything in Britain predated the Iron Age by thousands of years. Radiocarbon dating did not exist until the late 1940s and its application to Stonehenge, and the subsequent recalibration that pushed the dates back further still, is what finally made the chronology firm. Before that, there was no method on Earth for telling whether a British monument was 2,000 or 5,000 years old. Every pre-20th century theory about Stonehenge was necessarily guesswork about a structure whose age was completely unknown. Which is worth remembering the next time somebody presents a confident account of a prehistoric site. For most of the history of thinking about Stonehenge, the single most basic fact about it, when it was made, was entirely unavailable, and every explanation built in that period was built on sand. The tools that fixed it are less than a lifetime old. The second was William Stukely in the 18th century, who took Aubrey's suggestion and built a life on it. Stukely was a genuinely important figure. His surveys of Stonehenge and Avebury were meticulous. He recorded the avenue and the cursus, and he was among the first to note the solstice alignment. He also became passionately committed to the Druid theory, styled himself a Druid, and published elaborate accounts connecting the monument to an imagined ancient priesthood of patriarchal religion. His books were widely read, and the association stuck. It stuck so hard that in the early 20th century, revival Druid orders. Modern organisations with no historical continuity to the Iron Age priesthood began holding ceremonies at Stonehenge, and they have continued to do so. The revival itself is a curious story. Modern Druidry begins in the 18th century, in the same intellectual moment that produced Stukely. A period of enthusiasm for a romanticised Celtic past, much of it constructed from very little evidence, and some of it, notably in Wales, from documents that were straightforwardly invented by their supposed discoverers. What grew out of that has since become a genuine and legally recognised religion with sincere adherents, which is an odd trajectory for a movement founded on a historical mistake, though not unique. A good many traditions turn out on inspection to be younger than they claim. The image of white-robed figures among the stones is now so established that it is genuinely difficult to dislodge, and it appears constantly in popular illustration. None of this is a scandal, and modern Druid practice is a sincere contemporary spiritual movement whose adherents are generally well aware of the archaeology. But the historical claim is simply false, and it is worth being clear about the mechanism. A reasonable guess made in the absence of evidence, amplified by a persuasive writer, repeated for 3 centuries until it became something everybody knows. That mechanism is not confined to Stonehenge, and it is worth recognizing when it appears elsewhere. The general shape is: a plausible guess is made under conditions of severe evidence scarcity. A persuasive communicator adopts it and gives it narrative appeal. It is repeated across generations until it acquires the status of common knowledge, and by the time the evidence arrives to test it, the belief is so widely held that the correction sounds like the eccentric claim. Aubrey's guess was reasonable. Stukely's enthusiasm was infectious. 300 years later, the archaeology is unambiguous, and the Druids are still on the tea towels. The Druids are the most successful wrong answer, but they are not the only one, and the collection is instructive because the errors share a family resemblance. The medieval answer was Merlin. In the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a history of the kings of Britain that was enormously popular and largely invented, and in it he explained Stonehenge. The stones were originally a monument in Ireland called the Giant's Ring, brought there from Africa by giants, and Merlin the magician transported them to Salisbury Plain by his arts to serve as a memorial for British nobles killed by the Saxons. It is a fine story. It is also, in one respect, oddly close to something true. The idea that the stones were brought from far away, already arranged as a monument, and re-erected here, which is remarkably like the Warn-Morn hypothesis. Whether that reflects a garbled folk memory carried across 3,000 years, or simply a coincidence of imagination is impossible to say, and it would be irresponsible to lean on it. But it is a strange echo. The responsible position is that Geoffrey was an inventive writer, producing entertaining pseudo-history for a Norman audience, that he had no access to Neolithic information, and that the resemblance is almost certainly accident. Oral traditions can preserve real material across astonishing spans. The Rapa Nui remembered that their statues walked, and they were right. But 3,000 years and a complete population turnover is a very long chain, and there is no evidence of any intervening transmission. File it as a curiosity. The Renaissance and early modern answers were Romans, Danes, and Phoenicians. Inigo Jones, the architect, was commissioned to study the monument in the 17th century and concluded it was a Roman temple, essentially because he could not believe the ancient Britons capable of classical proportion. Others credited Danish invaders. Others, in the 18th and 19th centuries, reached for Phoenicians or Egyptians on the general principle that impressive architecture must have arrived from the Eastern Mediterranean. The 20th century answers included lost continents and visitors from other planets. Atlantis appears regularly. So do aliens, in the strain of popular writing that attributes ancient monuments worldwide to extraterrestrial engineering. Now notice the pattern. Romans, Danes, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Atlanteans, aliens. Every one of those answers imports the builders from somewhere else. Across 3 centuries and many different intellectual fashions, the persistent instinct has been that the people who actually lived on Salisbury Plain in the 3rd millennium BC could not have built this, and that someone more advanced must have been responsible. That instinct is not confined to Britain. It is the same reflex that attributed Great Zimbabwe to Phoenicians rather than to the Shona, that credited the North American mound builders to a vanished race rather than to Native American ancestors, and that insisted for 2 centuries that Polynesians could not have found Easter Island. In each case, the reasoning is identical, and in each case, it has been wrong. What makes Stonehenge's version notable is that the people being denied credit are the ancestors of the modern British population that has been doing much of the denying. And the denial has real consequences for how prehistory is understood generally. If you assume that impressive things require advanced outsiders, then every impressive thing found in an unexpected place becomes evidence of contact, diffusion, or lost civilizations, and the actual capabilities of ordinary people in the deep past disappear from view. The alternative assumption that human beings anywhere, given time and reason, will build remarkable things, turns out to fit the evidence far better nearly everywhere it has been tested. The reflex is not simply about race or empire, it is about time. We find it difficult to believe that people who lived very long ago, without our tools, were as intelligent as we are. They were. They were exactly as intelligent as we are, with less accumulated knowledge and different problems. And given 400 years and a reason, they built this. The 400 years is the part people skip. Nobody in this story woke up one morning and built Stonehenge. What happened was that a great many ordinary people across 16 generations each did a manageable amount of work. Dug a section of ditch, hauled on a rope for a season, carved a stone over a year, walked to a festival and helped. And the accumulation of all those manageable amounts is a monument that has stood for 4,500 years. That is how nearly everything large gets made, and it is why the search for an extraordinary explanation always misses the point. So, honestly, what was Stonehenge for? Several serious answers exist, and the best current position is that they are all partly right, because a monument used for 1,500 years does not have a single function any more than a cathedral does. It was a cemetery. This is the most securely evidenced function and the one most often left out. The cremated remains of at least 150 people, deposited over 5 centuries in the earliest and longest running phase of use. Whatever else it became, Stonehenge began as a place for the dead. It was a solar instrument. The axis is aligned on the solstices with real precision, and the alignment is built into the structure rather than being incidental. How precise is worth quantifying, because the claims range wildly. The axis is accurate to within about a degree of the solstice sunrise and sunset positions for the period. Good enough to be unmistakably deliberate, and not good enough to support the fine-grained astronomical claims sometimes made. A degree is roughly twice the width of the sun's disk. That is the accuracy of careful naked-eye observation repeated over years, which is exactly what we should expect. And it is impressive precisely because it is achievable rather than miraculous. Whether observatory is the right word is a matter of dispute. The extreme claims of the 1960s, which read the monument as an eclipse-predicting computer, have not survived scrutiny, and most researchers now regard the astronomy as ceremonial rather than scientific. But the builders tracked the sun's turning and built its position permanently into the ground. It was a place of assembly. The Durrington evidence makes this unavoidable. Gatherings drawing people and animals from across Britain at midwinter for feasting on an enormous scale. Whatever the ceremonies were, they were mass events, and they may have been among the very few occasions when populations from distant parts of the island met at all. And the practical consequences of that would have gone well beyond ceremony. A gathering of that scale is where marriages get arranged between distant communities, where goods and raw materials change hands, where disputes get settled, where news travels, where techniques spread, and where a shared language and a shared set of practices are maintained across an island that would otherwise fragment into isolated valleys. The archaeology of Britain in this period shows a remarkable degree of cultural uniformity. Similar pottery, similar monuments, similar practices from the south coast to Orkney. And gatherings like the one at Durrington are the most plausible mechanism for producing it. It may have been a place of healing. This interpretation rests largely on the bluestones and their possible association with sacred springs in Wales, and on the observation that a number of burials in the immediate area show evidence of illness or injury, including at Boscombe, Down and elsewhere, individuals from distant places. The evidence is suggestive rather than compelling, but the idea that people travelled to Stonehenge seeking something has support. The healing interpretation was advanced most prominently by two archaeologists who excavated inside the circle in 2008 and who argued that the bluestones were the point of the whole monument, that people came from across Britain and beyond because the stones themselves were believed to have curative power, and that Stonehenge was, in effect, a prehistoric Lourdes. Critics note that the burial evidence for unusual rates of illness is weak, and that sick people turn up in every cemetery. The idea remains on the table without commanding agreement, which is the usual condition of interpretation at this site. And it may have been, above all, a project. This is the interpretation that has gained ground most in recent years, that the building of Stonehenge functioned as a mechanism for creating and maintaining unity between communities across a wide area. That the point of hauling stones from Wales and assembling thousands of people at midwinter was the assembling itself. On this reading, the monument is a byproduct of a social process, and the process was the construction of a shared identity across an island of scattered farming communities. Some researchers have gone further and suggested it may have marked a moment of political unification in Britain, with the monument as its physical expression. The argument runs roughly as follows. The Great Sarsen phase around 2500 BC coincides with a period when regional differences in material culture across Britain appear to diminish, when the Durrington gatherings were drawing people and animals from the whole island, and when, if the worn Morn interpretation holds, a Welsh community physically transplanted its monument to Salisbury Plain. On that reading, Stonehenge is the monument of a moment when scattered communities across an island decided, for whatever reason, to act as one thing. It is a large claim resting on circumstantial convergence, and it should be labelled as a hypothesis rather than a finding. But it is the most ambitious idea currently on the table, and it fits an uncomfortable amount of the evidence. The honest summary is that Stonehenge was a cemetery that became a temple that functioned as a calendar and served as the focus of an island-wide festival built over so long a period that it was several different things to several different societies, at least one of which was not descended from the one before. That is not a failure to answer the question. That is what a 1500-year-old building actually is. Ask what Westminster Abbey is for, and the honest answer is layered in the same way. A church, a coronation site, a burial ground for monarchs and poets, a tourist attraction, a national symbol, a working parish. It has been all of those at different times and several at once, and no single answer is wrong. The difference is that we have the documents for the Abbey. If everything written about it were destroyed and it were excavated in 4,000 years, the archaeologists would face exactly the problem that Stonehenge presents. A structure of obvious importance, rebuilt many times, full of graves, aligned to the east, and completely silent about what any of it was supposed to mean. Around 1500 BC, work at Stonehenge ended. Not dramatically, as far as anyone can tell. There is no destruction layer, no sign of violence, no evidence that the monument was attacked or deliberately dismantled. The building simply stopped, and over the following centuries the site slid out of active use. Several things were changing at once. The society was reorganizing itself around different priorities. The early Bronze Age in Britain saw the rise of individual wealth, metal production, and long-distance elite exchange. The world of the Amesbury archer and bush barrow. Prestige was increasingly expressed through personal possessions and individual burial rather than through collective monuments. In that world, the return on a communal construction project of enormous cost was falling. The settlement pattern was changing too. Through the second millennium BC, Britain moved decisively toward permanent field systems, boundaries, and settled farming landscapes, enclosed fields, defined territories, and eventually hill forts. That is a society investing in land and property, marking out who owns what, rather than one gathering periodically at shared ceremonial centres. Once you have fields, you have less reason to walk your pigs 200 kilometres in December, and there is a deeper point buried in that. A monument built by voluntary assembly depends entirely on people continuing to want to come. It has no endowment, no priesthood with property, no state to compel attendance. The whole institution rests on the annual decision of thousands of individuals that the journey is worth making. That is an enormously powerful mechanism while it works, and an extremely fragile one when the reasons change. Stonehenge did not fall. Its attendance declined, which is, in the end, how most institutions actually end. Very few things are destroyed. Most simply stop being worth the trouble, one household at a time, until the year comes when not enough people set out and the thing quietly ceases to happen. Nobody would have marked that year. Somebody would have been the last person to walk up the avenue at midwinter with a purpose, and would have gone home afterward, assuming they would return. And the gatherings themselves may simply have run their course. Institutions have lifespans. A midwinter assembly that had drawn people from across Britain for centuries may have declined for any number of ordinary reasons. Competing centres, shifting alliances, a generation that stopped coming. And once such a thing loses its momentum, it is very difficult to restart. There is also evidence of climatic deterioration in the later second millennium, with cooler and wetter conditions affecting agriculture in northern Britain particularly, though its relevance to Salisbury Plain specifically is uncertain. What is striking is what did not happen. The monument was not destroyed. It was not quarried for building stone in any systematic way for thousands of years. People continued to bury their dead in its landscape long after the ceremonies ended, and Bronze Age and later communities left objects at the site. Whatever institution had built it faded, but the stones retained enough significance, or enough unease, that nobody pulled them down. Compare that with what usually happens to abandoned monumental architecture. Roman Britain's towns were quarried for their stone for 1,000 years. Medieval abbeys were dismantled for building material within decades of their dissolution. Ancient masonry across Europe survives mainly when nobody needed it. Stonehenge stood in an inhabited landscape for 4,000 years, made of exactly the kind of hard stone that would have been useful and was never systematically taken apart. Pieces were chipped off and 1 or 2 stones were broken up, but the structure was left. That is a long time for a society to keep not doing something. They simply stood there in an emptying landscape as the society that had raised them turned its attention to fields and metal and chiefs, and the meaning drained slowly out of the arrangement until nobody was left who knew what it had been for. Before following the stones into their long afterlife, it is worth listing plainly what remains open, because a great deal has been settled in the last 20 years, and it can produce a false impression that the site has been solved. We do not know what it was called. Not the Neolithic name, not the Bronze Age name, not any word in the language of the people who built it. The name Stonehenge is Anglo-Saxon and describes the shape. We do not know a single thing anyone said there. No prayer, no chant, no formula, no explanation. Whatever was spoken inside that circle at midwinter across 15 centuries is gone completely, and no technique now imaginable will recover it. We do not know what happened during a ceremony, whether there was music and what instruments, whether people danced, whether anyone was permitted inside the circle or only certain people, whether the ceremonies were public spectacles or restricted rites, whether they were joyful, solemn, frightening, or all three in sequence. We do not know who was allowed to be buried there or why those individuals rather than others. Men, women, and children are all present, which rules out the simplest explanations, and no clear criterion has emerged. We do not know how the level of the lintel ring was surveyed. We do not know why 2 of the sarcens come from a different source than the other 50, or where that source is. We do not know how the altar stone travelled from northern Scotland, if the new provenance holds, or why anyone would bring a stone that far when a comparable slab could have been found within a day's walk. We do not know whether the Warnmorn Circle really is the origin of the Bluestones. The case is strong and contested and unlikely to be settled soon. We do not know whether the lunar alignments are intentional. We do not know why the Bluestones were rearranged so many times. We do not know whether religious knowledge passed from the Neolithic population to the Beaker arrivals, or whether the newcomers inherited a structure whose purpose they reinvented. We do not know the year the last ceremony was held, or whether anyone present understood it was the last. We do not know whether Stonehenge had a name for the people who built it, in the sense we mean by a name, or whether it was simply the place, needing no designation at all among people for whom there was only one. That is a substantial list, and it will be shorter in 20 years because it has become shorter in each of the last several decades. Techniques that did not exist in 1990, strontium isotope analysis, ancient DNA, laser scanning, chemical fingerprinting of stone, ground-penetrating radar across whole landscapes, have answered questions that seemed permanently closed. Most of the Stonehenge landscape has never been excavated. It is entirely possible that the largest discoveries about this monument have not been made yet. But the innermost question is probably not on that list. Techniques recover physical facts. The meaning of the monument was carried in speech, in a language that was never written, by people who have been dead for 4,000 years, and no instrument reaches it. We will very likely know, eventually, almost everything about how Stonehenge was built, and by whom, and at what cost, and never know what they thought they were doing. There is a way of finding that consoling rather than frustrating, and it is probably the right way to hold it. Every generation that has looked at this monument has explained it in the terms available to them. Giants, magicians, Romans, Druids, astronomers, computers, aliens, festivals, ancestors. Every one of those explanations tells you a great deal about the age that produced it, and nothing reliable about the Neolithic. Ours will look the same to whoever comes next. The stones will still be standing, and somebody in 300 years will explain them again, in terms we would not recognize, and be equally sure. The building is finished, and the builders are gone. Before we follow the stones through the long centuries of their afterlife, the night pauses one last time, out on the plain, in the dark. It is a clear night in late autumn, some centuries after the last work was done. The plain is empty. There is no gathering. There has not been one for a long time. The village at Durrington is grass. The timber circles have rotted down to stumps and then to nothing, and the ground where they stood shows only as a faint unevenness that you would not notice unless you knew. The stones are still there. They stand black against the sky, the trilithons and the outer ring, and the lintels make a hard flat line across the stars where the circle runs. They have weathered now, no longer the pale raw surfaces of the newly dressed Sarsens, but grey and lichened, settled into the landscape, looking older than they are. Grass has grown up around their bases. A few have shifted slightly where the chalk beneath them has moved. The lichen has begun its slow work, the pale crusts spreading across the western faces where the weather comes from, and the sharp edges left by the hammerstones have started to round. In another 1,000 years the stones will look ancient. Tonight they still look made. Overhead the sky is enormous and completely dark, in the way that no sky in southern England is dark anymore. The stars come right down to the horizon on every side. The Milky Way runs across the whole of it. There is no light anywhere on the plain except starlight, and the stones catch just enough of it to be visible as shapes. A ring of standing darkness, slightly darker than the dark around it. The wind moves over the grass. Something small runs in the turf. Out on the ridges the barrows stand in their lines, holding their dead, invisible now, each one placed a long time ago so that the stones could be seen from it. There is a great quiet in that, and a great rest. Everyone who dug the ditch is gone. Everyone who hauled the stones from Wales is gone, and everyone who feasted at Durrington, and everyone who walked up the avenue at midwinter with the whole island gathered behind them. The people who replaced them are gone too. Nobody now alive on this plain knows what the monument was for, and nobody will know again for 4,000 years, and even then not entirely. And the stones stand, and the stars turn over them the way they have turned since the first ditch was cut, and the axis still points where it always pointed, at a sunset that will happen again in a few weeks, whether anyone is there to watch it or not. Rest here a while, in the dark, on the empty plain, with the ring of stones standing black against the stars, and the whole long story of them already finished, and not yet begun. An owl goes over on soundless wings, and is gone before the eye can fix on it. The grass moves in a long, slow wave when the air shifts, and then settles, and then moves again. And the stones stand exactly where they were put, holding a line drawn by somebody who watched the winter sun for years to get it right, pointing at a horizon nobody is watching tonight. The stars come round as they always do. Toward the small hours, the eastern sky begins to grey a little at its lowest edge, and the shapes of the stones begin to separate from the darkness behind them, and another day starts on the plain with nobody there to see it begin. For most of the last 4,000 years, Stonehenge was simply there, an inexplicable ruin on a plain, passed by people who had no idea what it was and who made up whatever they needed it to be. The Romans arrived in Britain in the 1st century AD and evidently visited the site. Roman objects have been found there in some quantity, including pottery and coins, suggesting curiosity, possibly ritual activity, certainly tourism. Some archaeologists have argued the Roman material indicates more than sightseeing, that objects were being deliberately deposited at the stones, which would make Stonehenge an active cult site in the Roman period, 2,500 years after it was built. Others read the same finds as the debris of visitors. Either way, there were Romans standing among those stones wondering what they were, and the gap between them and the builders was longer than the gap between them and us. That comparison does something useful to the sense of scale. A Roman soldier standing at Stonehenge in the 1st century AD was closer in time to us than to the people who raised the Saracens. Julius Caesar is nearer to the modern world than to the completion of that monument. Almost everything most people think of as history. Egypt's New Kingdom, classical Greece, Rome, the entire Christian era, every empire anyone can name, happened after Stonehenge was finished and abandoned. But no Roman writer offers an explanation, which is itself interesting. A literate empire with a taste for describing the wonders of its provinces left no account of the most remarkable structure in Britain. The Anglo-Saxons gave it its name. Stonehenge derives from Old English, most plausibly from stan, meaning stone, and either henkji, meaning hinge, a reference to the lintels hanging on the uprights, or hen sion, meaning gallows, since a trilithon looks something like a gibbet. Either way, the name describes the shape rather than the purpose. The people naming it had no idea who built it. The Anglo-Saxons had a general word for the ancient structures they found across Britain: the Roman ruins, the prehistoric earthworks, the abandoned stone. And a poem survives in which such remains are described as the work of giants, standing empty and frost-covered, their builders long dead, and their halls silent. That poem is 1,000 years old, and it is about looking at ruins that were already ancient. Stonehenge has been an object of melancholy speculation for a very long time, and that is one of the few genuine continuities in this whole story. The Anglo-Saxons stood in front of the stones and felt the weight of a vanished people. The medieval chroniclers felt it and reached for giants. The Romantics felt it and painted storms. Modern visitors feel it and buy a guidebook. Different explanations in every century, and underneath them the same reaction. A specific unease produced by standing next to enormous deliberate work whose makers left no word. That reaction may be the closest thing to shared experience we have with the people who built it, since it is presumably some version of what they intended a visitor to feel. Then, in the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth supplied Merlin and the giants, and that story dominated the European imagination for 400 years. It is worth registering how thoroughly it dominated. For most of the medieval and early modern period, if an educated European knew anything about Stonehenge, they knew that Merlin had brought the stones from Ireland. That was the answer, held with the same confidence that the Druid answer is held today for a comparable length of time, and it was completely wrong, which is a useful thing to remember when considering how secure our current answers are. The archaeology is enormously better than Geoffrey's imagination, but the confidence with which each age has explained this monument has never been a reliable guide to its accuracy. It gave the monument a place in Arthurian legend and a reason to exist, and it was accepted broadly enough that medieval illustrations show Merlin lifting the stones into place. In one of the earliest known depictions of Stonehenge, from a 14th century manuscript, a giant helps him. The illustration is worth picturing. Merlin, in medieval dress, standing beside a trilithon while a giant lifts a lintel into place, drawn by someone who had probably never seen the monument and was working from the text. It is the oldest picture of Stonehenge we have, and it is a picture of a story rather than a place. The Middle Ages were not gentle to the site in practical terms. Stones were broken up in places, and there is documentary evidence of medieval and later damage, including a large pit dug in the 17th century by a duke who wanted to see what was underneath. Visitors chipped pieces off with hammers for centuries, a practice so widespread that tools could be hired locally for the purpose, and the surfaces of some stones are visibly scarred by it. Some of that damage is now itself historic. Names and initials are carved into several of the stones, the earliest legible ones dating back centuries, and they are protected along with everything else. Laser survey of the monument in the 2010s recorded thousands of individual marks on the stone surfaces, and among the modern graffiti it found something far older. Carvings of Bronze Age axe heads and at least one dagger cut into the Sarsens sometime around 1750 to 1500 BC. There are over 100 of them, mostly on the inward faces of a few stones, invisible in ordinary light and revealed only by scanning. People were marking these stones with images of their weapons within a few centuries of the monument's completion, and nobody noticed until the 21st century. The axe heads are of a type used around 1750 to 1500 BC, which is to say, they were carved by the Bronze Age communities who were burying their dead in the barrows around the site, at a period when the monument itself was falling out of active use. Somebody was still coming to these stones and marking them with the objects that mattered to them 1,000 years after the Sarsens went up. Whatever they thought they were doing, it was not neglect. And through all of that, the monument was farmland. For most of its existence since the Bronze Age, Stonehenge stood in the middle of a working agricultural landscape, with sheep grazing among the stones and carts passing on the tracks, unfenced, unguarded, and largely unregarded. The photographs from the 19th century show exactly that. Leaning stones, several fallen, grass and thistles, and a few visitors in Victorian dress standing about in what is essentially a field. The modern career of Stonehenge, as a national symbol, a research problem, and eventually a global icon, begins in the 17th century with the first people who tried to study it systematically. Inigo Jones surveyed it in the 1620s at the request of the king and produced a reconstruction that was largely his own architectural imagination. A symmetrical Roman temple, regularized into classical proportions, the monument does not have. John Aubrey did better a few decades later, actually measuring and recording, finding the pits that bear his name, and reasoning his way to the Druids. William Stukeley, in the 1720s, did better still. His fieldwork was genuinely excellent. He identified the avenue and the cursus, and recorded features since destroyed by ploughing, and he noted the solstice alignment explicitly. His Druidic theorizing has aged badly. His surveys have not. Then came the Romantics, and Stonehenge became a feeling rather than a problem. Turner painted it under a lightning storm with dead sheep, and a shepherd struck down beside them. Sublime, terrible, indifferent nature. Constable painted it as a ruin under a broken sky, and wrote that it stood remote from anything, and carried the mind beyond all historical record into the obscurity of a totally unknown period. That phrase repays attention because it identifies precisely what the monument does that a text-bearing ruin cannot. A Roman site returns you to a known world. Stonehenge returns you to a world with no record at all, and the pleasure, or the vertigo, comes from standing in front of something built with obvious intelligence and intention by a mind you cannot reach. Wordsworth put a vision of ancient sacrifice among the stones. Thomas Hardy, at the end of the century, made it the place where Tess is finally taken, sleeping on the altar stone at dawn while the police close in. The most famous appearance of the monument in English literature, and one that fixed its association with fate, sacrifice, and inevitability in the popular mind for a century. That romantic inheritance matters more than it might seem, because it shaped what people expect Stonehenge to be. The 19th century wanted ancient monuments to be dark, sacrificial, and mysterious, and it read those qualities into the stones, and the reading stuck. The blood-stained altar of Victorian imagination is entirely fictional. The so-called altar stone is a fallen sandstone slab with no evidence of any such use, and there is no evidence of human sacrifice at Stonehenge at all, nor of any of the other things the Victorian imagination supplied. No blood grooves, despite the persistent claim that the altar stone has them. No mass graves of victims. The one burial at the site that shows violent death is an Anglo-Saxon man, executed by decapitation and buried in the ditch around the 7th century AD. 3,500 years after the monument was built, when the site appears to have been used as an execution ground, which was a common use for prominent ancient landmarks in that period. Even Stonehenge's one violent skeleton belongs to a completely different era from the one people imagine. There is a further irony in it. The Anglo-Saxon execution site interpretation means that the monument's association with death and violence. The thing the Victorians imagined into its Neolithic past is real, but arrives 4,000 years late and belongs to a Christian kingdom rather than to any pagan priesthood. Stonehenge did eventually become a place where people were killed. It just happened around the 7th century AD under a king with a rope. But the atmosphere the Romantics built around the place has proved more durable than any archaeological correction, and it is a substantial part of why 1 million people a year want to stand there, which is not entirely a bad thing. The Romantic reading is factually wrong and emotionally close to something real. These stones were built by people who intended them to produce awe, and the Victorians duly felt awe, even if the specific content they supplied, the sacrifices, the dark rites, the fatalism, came from their own imaginations rather than from the Neolithic. The mechanism worked. The interpretation was invented. That is more or less what has happened in every century. Stonehenge entered the 20th century in poor condition and in private hands, and what happened next is a small case study in what a society does with an inherited monument. In 1900, a stone fell. Public alarm followed, and the owner. The monument sat on a private estate, fenced the site and began charging admission, which caused considerable outrage in a country accustomed to wandering up to it freely. In 1915, the whole thing was sold at auction. A local man named Cecil Chubb bought it, reportedly on impulse, for £6,600. 3 years later, he gave it to the nation. The story goes that he attended the auction to buy some dining chairs and came home with a prehistoric monument, which is the kind of anecdote that survives whether or not it is precisely true. His deed of gift attached conditions, that the public should have access and that the admission charge should not exceed £1. He was made a baronet for it. Then came the restorations, and they are the part most visitors do not know about. Between 1901 and 1964, in several campaigns, a substantial number of the stones were straightened, re-erected, and set in concrete. Leaning uprights were pulled vertical. Fallen trilithons were raised. Stones were lifted out, their sockets deepened and reinforced, and the stones replaced. The work was done to prevent collapse, and it saved the monument. But it means that the Stonehenge people photographed today is significantly a 20th century reconstruction of what archaeologists of the period believed it should look like. The 1958 campaign, for instance, re-erected a fallen trilithon and set the stones in concrete foundations. Earlier work had straightened leaning uprights and repositioned others. In several cases, the modern setting corrected a lean that had developed over millennia, which is a defensible conservation decision. But it also means that any measurement of the alignments today is measuring a monument partly positioned by 20th century judgment about where the stones had originally stood. For most purposes, the difference is trivial. For claims about precise astronomical accuracy, it is not. That is worth stating plainly, because it is often perceived as a scandal when people discover it. It is not concealed. It is well documented, and the interventions were made by serious people with reasonable motives in an era with different conservation ethics. Modern conservation practice would handle it differently. Minimal intervention, reversibility, extensive recording before anything is touched. And some of the 20th century work would not be permitted today. But the counterfactual is worth stating plainly. Without those campaigns, more stones would have fallen, and some would have broken when they did. The monument that 1 million people a year come to see exists in its current form because a series of engineers in the last century decided it should. But it does mean that the precise positions of some stones reflect 20th century judgment rather than Neolithic intention, which matters when the alignments are being measured to fractions of a degree. Access became the other running argument. A main road ran within meters of the stones for decades, and a second crossed the landscape nearby, so that the monument sat in the angle of a busy junction with a car park and a subway and a fence. Photographs from the second half of the 20th century are genuinely dispiriting. The stones behind wire, traffic streaming past a few dozen meters away, a tunnel under the road for visitors, and a landscape sliced by tarmac. A parliamentary committee in 1993 described the arrangements as a national disgrace, and the phrase stuck for the better part of 2 decades. Visitors were allowed among the stones until 1977, when erosion of the ground and damage to the surfaces led to the roping off that persists today. You now walk around the monument at a distance rather than through it, except by special arrangement or at the solstice. The road was finally addressed in part in the 2010s, with one route closed and grassed over, and a new visitor centre built well away from the stones, so that the immediate setting is quieter and greener than it has been in a century. A long-running and heavily contested proposal to put the remaining main road into a tunnel beneath the World Heritage landscape has occupied planners, archaeologists, campaigners, and courts for years, with arguments about traffic, setting, and the unexcavated archaeology that any tunnel would destroy. It remains unresolved, and it is the current form of a question that has followed the monument for 100 years. Who does it belong to? And what are we allowed to do around it? The arguments on each side are serious. Supporters point to a landscape currently divided by a busy road, with the monument's setting compromised by traffic noise and lights, and argue that burying the road would restore something close to the ancient experience. Opponents point out that a tunnel requires enormous cuttings at each end, that those cuttings would sit inside a World Heritage landscape whose archaeological potential is largely unexcavated, and that whatever lies in that ground would be destroyed permanently to solve a traffic problem. Both are arguing about how best to respect the same monument, which is why the dispute has proved so difficult to settle. Every June, and less famously every December, the monument opens and people come. The modern solstice gathering has a tangled history. Revival Druid orders, founded in the 18th and 19th centuries with no continuity to the Iron Age priesthood, began holding ceremonies at the stones in the early 20th century. From the 1970s, a free festival grew up in the landscape around midsummer, running for years and attracting tens of thousands, until conflict between festival goers and authorities culminated in a violent confrontation in 1985, and a period during which access was heavily restricted and the solstice was policed with exclusion zones. Managed open access was restored in 2000, and now several thousand people gather each June to watch the sunrise, along with a smaller and generally quieter crowd at midwinter. The scene is genuinely strange and worth describing without either mockery or reverence. There are modern Druids in white robes conducting ceremonies they have devised. There are pagans and neo-pagans of various traditions for whom the site is sincerely sacred. There are people who have driven through the night because it seemed like a thing to do. There are tourists, photographers, drummers, families, and a large number of people who are simply cold and waiting. And there are archaeologists, some of whom find the whole thing an anachronistic performance, and some of whom point out that a monument built for mass midwinter assembly is arguably being used more appropriately at the solstice than on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon with a rope around it. That last point deserves a moment. It is easy to be snobbish about the solstice crowds, and easy to note that they are gathering at the wrong solstice, facing the wrong direction, in robes belonging to the wrong millennium, in honour of a priesthood that had nothing to do with the place. All of that is true. It is also true that Stonehenge was built as a gathering place, a monument designed so that large numbers of people could converge on it at a turning point of the year from a long way off and stand together and watch the sun do what it does. Of all the things the monument has been used for in the last 4,000 years, a crowd assembling to mark a solstice is by some distance the closest to its original function. The theology is wrong. The date is half wrong. The crowd is doing, in outline, exactly what the builders designed the place for. And there is a further irony worth noting. For most of the 20th century, the argument about solstice access was framed as a conflict between the people who wanted to protect the monument and the people who wanted to use it. The archaeology has quietly undermined that framing. A monument built specifically to accommodate a large seasonal crowd is not being protected by keeping crowds away from it. It is being converted into something else. A specimen rather than a gathering place. What the right balance is between conservation and use remains a genuine and difficult question, but the assumption that Stonehenge is properly experienced in silence from behind a rope is not supported by anything the builders did. Step back from the chronology and the arguments, and remember that all of this was done by individual people whose names are permanently lost. There was somebody who cut chalk with a red deer antler in 3000 BC. The antler picks come out of the ditch in their hundreds, and many of them are broken, which means somebody was working hard enough to break them. That person knew where the deer dropped their antlers in spring and went and collected them. They knew how the chalk breaks, which layers come away cleanly and which are flinty and will ruin a pick. They dug a segment of ditch alongside their own family or village group, and when they had finished their length, they met the next group coming the other way. Their hands would have been in a state that anyone who has done manual work in cold weather would recognize instantly. They were as real as you are, and the work had a rhythm we can partly reconstruct. Antler is at its best shed fresh in spring. The ditch segments suggest team-based digging. The chalk comes out in blocks that have to be lifted up and over a growing bank. A person doing that for a season would develop a very specific set of muscles and a very specific set of injuries. Skeletal remains from Neolithic Britain show exactly the wear patterns you would expect from a life of heavy manual labour beginning in adolescence. Spinal compression, joint damage, healed fractures. They were not larger or stronger than modern people. They simply worked harder from younger with worse tools. Life expectancy in Neolithic Britain was low by modern standards, though the figure is misleading in the usual way. High infant mortality drags the average down, and a person who survived childhood could reasonably expect to reach their 50s or beyond. What the skeletons show is not a short life, but a physically demanding one, with the wear starting early and accumulating. The people who built Stonehenge were, in the main, in their 20s and 30s, doing heavy work, with bodies that showed it by 40. There was somebody who worked out the alignment. Somebody had to stand on that plain over a period of years and watch where the sun set at the turning of the year and mark it and check it and mark it again. Because you cannot establish a solstice line from one winter's observation. The sun's setting point barely moves for several days around the solstice, and getting it right requires patient repetition over multiple years. Then they had to translate that observation into a line on the ground that hundreds of people would build to. That is a person doing astronomy 5,000 years ago without a single instrument. They were as real as you are, and they must have had a way of recording intermediate results across years. A post driven into the ground here, a marker there, a stone left where the shadow fell. Because you cannot hold that kind of comparison in memory across a decade of winters without external notes of some kind. Some of the post holes found around the Stonehenge entrance may be exactly that. The working notes of somebody establishing a line, left in the ground, indistinguishable now from any other hole. There was somebody on a rope. Several hundred people, in fact, on the day each sarsen went up, hauling together while somebody else called the rhythm, with a 25-ton stone swinging up out of its pit, and the very real possibility of it going wrong. Somebody was in charge of the packing. Somebody was watching the ropes for fraying. And somebody had made the rope, which is its own forgotten industry. Neolithic cordage was made from plant, fibre and bast, twisted and plied, and the quantity required for a project of this scale is enormous. Hundreds of meters of heavy rope per stone, replaced as it wore, made by hand over months. Nobody thinks about the rope. Without it, there is no monument. Somebody's job that day was to stand where they could see the whole thing and shout if it started to go. And somebody, at some point across 400 years of this, was killed doing it. A 25-ton stone going up on ropes with hundreds of people hauling is not a safe operation by any standard, and it was repeated dozens of times. There is no record of it, because there are no records. But the arithmetic of that much heavy lifting with that much rope over that many years admits only one conclusion. And it is worth remembering that the monument almost certainly cost lives, and that nobody knows a single one of their names. There was a woman at Durrington in December, in a house with a chalk floor and a fire in the middle, in a settlement of several hundred houses full of people who had come from all over Britain, with the smell of roasting pig everywhere and more meat than anyone would see for the rest of the year. She had walked a long way to be there. She knew people at that gathering she saw once a year, at midwinter, and no other time. There would have been children born from marriages made at those gatherings, and old people making the journey for the last time knowing it, and disputes carried from one year to the next, and the whole texture of a social world that assembled and dispersed on an annual rhythm. For people living the rest of the year in scattered farmsteads of a few families, that midwinter fortnight would have been the largest thing in their lives. The only time they ever saw a crowd, heard other accents, or stood among more people than they could count. And there was somebody, at the very end, who was the last person to know what the monument was for. Somebody who had been told by an older relative, who had been told in turn, and who did not pass it on, or passed it on to someone who did not. That happened at a particular moment, in a particular year, and after it nobody on earth knew. Everything since, the giants and Merlin, the Romans and the Druids, the antiquarians and the archaeologists, has been an attempt to get back to what that person knew and did not say. And we will never get there. That is worth accepting rather than resenting. Everything recoverable about Stonehenge is physical. Where the stones came from, how they were shaped, when the ditch was cut, what people ate at Durrington, who was buried in the Aubrey holes, and where they grew up. The archaeology has been spectacularly successful at all of it. What died with that last person was the only part that cannot be excavated. The meaning, held in speech, in a language nobody recorded, about beliefs nobody wrote down. And there is no reason to think it was ever a single simple thing that could have been stated in a sentence. Ask what a cathedral means, and you will get different answers from an architect, a bishop, a stonemason, a tourist, and someone praying in it, all of them correct. Stonehenge stood for 1,500 years across at least two distinct populations. Whatever that last person knew was itself the end of a long chain of reinterpretation. One late version of a meaning that had already been changing for 1,000 years before they were born. 4,500 years after the Sarsens went up, 1 million people a year travel to look at them. It is worth asking why, because the answer says something about what the monument still is. It is not, primarily, information. Almost nobody visiting Stonehenge learns anything at the site that they could not learn better from a book or an hour of reading. The stones are roped off. You walk around them at a distance. There is a path and an audio guide and a gift shop. The intellectual content of the visit is low. What people go for is the encounter. Standing in front of something enormously old that was made deliberately, by hand, by people who are utterly gone, produces a specific and hard-to-describe response that has been noted by visitors in every century. A mixture of scale, time, and the physical evidence of intention. Constable called it carrying the mind beyond all historical record into the obscurity of a totally unknown period. That reaction is not archaeological knowledge. It is closer to what the builders may actually have been aiming at, which was an experience rather than an explanation. Everything about the design supports that. The hidden approach along the avenue, the sudden appearance of the monument over the crest, the framing of the sunset in the tallest trilithon, the enclosure of the interior so that the outside world disappears once you are inside the ring. These are the choices of people arranging what a visitor would feel, in sequence, on arrival. Stonehenge is not a diagram. It is a designed experience, and the fact that it still works on people who know nothing about it is the most direct evidence we have that the builders knew what they were doing. And the monument still does its one mechanical trick, perfectly, every year. Whatever the arguments about phases and restorations and degrees of alignment, the axis works. At midwinter, the sun goes down along the line the builders established, and at midsummer it comes up at the other end. That is a machine, built out of stone in the 3rd millennium BC, still running to specification after 4,500 years, with no maintenance beyond keeping the stones upright. There is one small caveat that a careful person should mention. The sun's position at the solstices has shifted very slightly over 5,000 years because the tilt of the Earth's axis changes slowly. The effect is real but small, a fraction of a degree, and it does not disturb the alignment in any way a person standing there would notice. The machine has drifted less in 50 centuries than the width of the stones it is built from. There is not much else on Earth of which that can be said. The comparison that gets made is with clocks, and it is not quite right. A clock measures time by running down and being wound. Stonehenge does not run at all. It simply sits still while the earth moves, and the movement of the earth does the work. The builders did not construct a mechanism. They constructed a fixed reference against which a mechanism already in motion could be read, which is, when you think about it, exactly what every observatory since has done. There is also the specific pleasure of a monument that has not been decoded. Egypt's temples are covered in writing. You can read the names and the prayers. Stonehenge says nothing. It presents itself as a pure object with all of its meaning removed, which leaves each visitor to supply their own, which is exactly what everyone has been doing since the Anglo-Saxons named it after a gallows. Compare it to the Parthenon, which comes with a literature. We know the goddess, the festival, the politics, the sculptor, the arguments about the funding, or to a cathedral whose iconography is legible to anyone who learns the code. Stonehenge offers nothing to read. There is no name for it, no name for anyone who built it, no word of the language they spoke, no image of a god, no depiction of a ceremony. The most famous prehistoric structure in the world is, informationally, almost entirely silent. And the silence is not damage. Nothing has been lost that was ever written. There was never anything to lose, which makes the archaeological achievement more remarkable rather than less. Working from nothing but physical residue. Antler picks, chalk fill, gnawed bone, isotope ratios in cremated fragments, the chemistry of a stone core drilled in 1958. Researchers have established when the ditch was cut, where every major stone came from, who was buried there and where they grew up, what people ate at the feasts and how far the animals had walked, and how the population of Britain changed while the monument stood. All of it recovered from rubbish, dirt, and stone. That is a genuinely extraordinary body of knowledge to have preased out of a silent object. The Druids, the Romantics, the astronomers, the solstice crowds, and the tunnel campaigners are all doing the same thing in different registers, standing in front of something silent and filling it in. The stones don't mind. That is perhaps the most consoling thing about them. Whatever anyone decides Stonehenge means, the monument is unchanged by it. The same 50-some Sarsens standing on the same chalk, aligned on the same sunset, indifferent to Merlin and to Stukely and to the archaeology and to the traffic. It has been a Druid temple, a Roman ruin, a Danish coronation site, a Merlin construction, an eclipse computer, a landing beacon, a national symbol, a festival ground, a police exclusion zone, a World Heritage Site, and a traffic problem. It has been none of those things. It has been a ring of dressed stones on a chalk plain, aligned on a sunset, the whole time. It was built to outlast the people who built it, and it has, comprehensively, and it will outlast us too. And now our long night on Salisbury Plain comes to its close, and it is time to set the whole of it down and let yourself sink toward sleep. There is nothing left to work out. The story has been told, and none of it needs carrying any further tonight. Let it settle now, softly, the way chalk dust settles in the bottom of a ditch that somebody dug 5,000 years ago and walked away from. Let it go. The pine posts standing on the plain before there were farmers, the white ring cut into the turf, the antler picks left where they broke. Let it go. The long barrows on the ridges and the cursors running for 3 kilometres across country, built by people whose names were already forgotten before the first stone was raised. Let it go. The stones coming out of the Welsh hills and the long, slow journey across Britain, the sledges and the ropes and the hundreds of people leaning into them. Let it drift away. The Sarsens rising out of their pits, the lintels going up on their towers of timber, the mortise and tenon dropping home, the midwinter light coming down the axis and lying along the ground. Let it go. The village at Durrington with its hundreds of fires, the pigs walked from Scotland, the procession down to the river, the crowd of an entire island gathered in the cold. Let it go. The barrows spreading along the ridges afterward, the man from the Alps with his gold and his ruined knee, the axe heads cut into the stone, by people who came 1,000 years late and marked it anyway. You do not need to hold any of it. Let it settle and dim and sink into the deep quiet where all the ages go. There is nothing you need to decide about it tonight. Not who built it, not what it was for, not whether the crowds face the right way or the road should go in a tunnel. Those questions have been open for 300 years of serious inquiry and 4,000 of guessing, and they will be open in the morning, and none of them has ever needed you to settle it. Feel how far away it all is now, and how safe you are here. 4,500 years of nights have passed over that plain since the great stones went up. Every one of the people in this story has long since lain down, exactly as you are lying down now, and let the day go and close their eyes. The one who dug the ditch with an antler. The one who watched the sunset for years to find the line. The hundreds on the ropes. The woman in the house at Durrington who had walked a long way and would walk home again. The man from the Alps with the bad knee. Every one of them slept, at the end of every day, on that same chalk, under that same enormous dark, with the wind going over the grass exactly as it goes over it tonight. They lay down in small round houses with a fire in the middle and a roof of thatch, with the smoke going up through it and the smell of wood smoke in everything they owned, and let the day go. The digging, the hauling, the walking, the watching of the sun, and closed their eyes and slept exactly as you are about to. Rest now, traveller. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let the weight of the day and the weight of those 45 centuries settle and release. Nothing about that plain requires your attention. The stones have been managing without observers for most of their existence, and they will manage tonight. There is nothing to solve and nothing to finish. What the monument was for can lie unanswered on the plain tonight, along with everything else. It has waited this long, and it will keep until morning. The arguments will still be there. The stones will still be there. They have been there through every night that anyone has ever failed to solve them, which is all of them. Sleep now. The plain is dark and quiet, and the grass is moving, and the ring of stones is standing where it has stood since before the pyramids, black against the stars, holding its line toward a sunset that will come again in its own time, whether anyone watches it or not. The people who built it are gone, every one, and the people who replaced them, and everyone who ever wondered at it since. 4,500 years of people have stood in front of those stones and not known, and gone home and died, and the stones have not moved. The Romans stood there and did not know. The Saxons named it for a gallows and did not know. The chroniclers wrote about giants and did not know. Stukely made himself a Druid and did not know. And every archaeologist who has ever worked there has come away with more facts and the same silence at the middle of them. The stones don't mind. They were made to outlast all of us, and they are doing it patiently in the dark on a chalk plain in the south of England tonight while you sleep. Let it carry you down gently into sleep. Sleep well, traveller. Good night.